Recording. Okay, there we go. Okay, so I think we're recording. Let's see, recording is in progress. Okay, that's good. And we're sharing screen, so I think we should be good. Great. Oh, click here. Yeah. So just save that. Yeah, and then we could actually put a link of it in Husky.
Yeah, I could just do that.
Yeah. Do that. Then they can just click on the link. And yeah, that sounds good. Oh yeah, you can probably put the link in the announcement too. All right. So last class of new content. So today we're going to talk about sample size issues and power analysis for multi-level models. Really important topic. We'll spend the entire class on it. It's a topic we could actually spend multiple classes on. So we'll, in some ways, just scratch the surface. But I do want to talk about how to do power analysis for especially like cluster randomized trials, multi-site and multi-site cluster randomized trials, and longitudinal designs. And so I'll give you sort of a taste of how to do power analyses. Well, how to think about power analysis first for multi-level studies, and then how to do some simple power analyses for a few different multi-level designs that are the most commonly used in educational research. We'll also talk about some other sample size issues that are unrelated to power. And then I will show you how to use a free software package called Optimal Design that allows you to do power analysis really, really, really easily. So the one thing is the Optimal Design package is in the courses folder right now. So you can access it from the courses folder. And we're also putting a link to it. You did it? Okay. So there's a link to it in the announcements for today. But we were not able to upload it to Husky CT because the actual power analysis program is a .exe file. And because lots of .exe files are viruses, it will not allow me to upload a .exe file to Husky CT, and I wasn't so sure I'd be able to email it to you either for that reason. So you're going to just, if you can either access it through the courses folder on the desktop, or you can access it through the link that is in the announcements, either or. And then you just download it, and it's really easy to run. And we're not going to run anything quite yet because we need to sort of talk about power analysis and sample size issues first. Okay, so that's today. There is a homework which will be, if it isn't already released, it'll be released in the next couple of hours while you're here in class. The homework for this week, let's make the homework due Monday of exam week. Give people,
what is that?
I don't know, what's Monday of exam week? The 12th. Okay. So the homework assignment for this week is actually worth more points than the other homework assignments. I need to figure out what the point system, it was originally set to be 1.5 times as many points as the other assignments. All of them were 6 and this was 9. Now we've had fewer homeworks, so those points are going to be adjusted a little bit, but it is worth actually like 1.5 times as many points as the normal assignments, and that's because it's a little bit longer. I don't know. Maybe it isn't going to be a little bit longer. It's a little bit longer in terms of writing. It might not actually be any more time, especially depends on how much time you spent on some of the other ones. But the first part is, there isn't any R, so it might go really quickly for you. So the first part is doing a few power analysis problems using the Optimal Design software, which I think is really straightforward. That is not the reason that it's more points. The second part is actually an article critique. So you need to read the article and then, provide a critique. There are guiding questions that you should really focus on critiquing using the guiding questions that I provide. And I'm really explicit in the instructions. I don't expect any kind of critique of like the conceptual framework or the literature review. This is really just a critique of the multi-level methods in the article. So again, it says that in the instructions, but I just want to say that again publicly, that so you can just really very quickly skim the first half of the article, just so you're not completely clueless about what's going on, but then really focus on the analysis, the results, and the discussion. And that's really the part that I expect you to critique. And I feel like an article critique is a little bit more, I don't know, right? It's sort of so you should be using the information that we've talked about throughout the semester. It sort of transcends just 1 week of content, and that's kind of the reason that I think of this as being like a bit more comprehensive, a homework assignment. So that'll be released today. You'll have until Monday of exam week for that. Yes. Yes, there are PowerPoint copies up here. I think somebody, grab another one too, because somebody else just walked in. Yeah. Great. There will be office hours this coming week, right? On Monday and Tuesday, as usual. We won't have, so you can ask questions about anything in those office hours, but the power analysis stuff or anything else. There won't be any office hours during exam week, the Monday and Tuesday of exam week. But remember that next week we're spending, I don't think, right? We don't need office hours, right? Yeah. But next week we're going to spend the entire week on a review session. So what you should be thinking about between this week and next week is what topics would you like to review next week in preparation for the final exam? And I will talk more next week about sort of the content and the format of the final exam. So the whole topic of the conversation next week is reviewing the semester, kind of, going through the semester, reviewing, and getting ready for the final. Okay, so those are the plans. So without further ado, let's talk about power and sample size issues in multi-level models. All right, and the reason that I'm kind of separating out power from sample size, and I think this is an important point actually, and when people think about, what sample size do you need to run an analysis, a lot of times people think that that's synonymous with power, but it's not necessarily. Power is one aspect of sample size planning, but it's not the only one. So for example, there's a question of how many people do you need to be adequately powered to detect an effective interest? That's what we're going to be talking about with power analysis. But another question is, how many observations do you need to be able to run the model, get the model to converge, and give you reasonably unbiased parameter estimates? And that's a different question, right? And you might, if your effect is very, very large, you might be adequately powered to detect an effective interest, but actually still be short in terms of the sample size that you really need to run the kind of model that you want. Conversely, you could have, more than enough people to run the model and sort of get unbiased parameter estimates, but you could still be woefully underpowered to detect the effects of interest. So I really like to think of these as sort of two separate issues. And, I guess you talk about this a little bit in other stats classes. Like, I don't know, did Eric ever give any kind of rules of thumb about multiple regression? How many, what sample size do you need for multiple regression? Okay, well, forget Eric. What? Oh, I'm just saying, but forget Eric. Forget about what Eric might have said. I know I'm going to ask you, as I didn't mean it that way. I meant forget Eric. If he didn't say anything, that's fine. But like, what do you think? If you were running a multiple regression, what would be the smallest sample size that you would be comfortable with? And what things might it depend on? Yeah, maybe how many independent variables you're adding to the model, right? For sure, yeah. How much error there is? What kind of error? Okay, like variance. Okay, so sure. I'm certainly, I would say biggest probably thing to think about in multiple regression is how many independent variables are you going to be adding to the model, right? And I mean, obviously the like total minimum is going to be like, I don't know, something ridiculous, right? Like you need at least 3 people for a simple linear regression or something like that. But like, would you feel comfortable running a simple linear regression with like 3 or 4 or 5 people? I mean, even if it would run, probably not, right? And would you feel, I mean, so there are all kinds of rules of thumb in multiple regression. People used to always say, like, this is, again, rules of thumb are just that. They're like these little, like, I don't know, nuggets of conventional wisdom that may or may not be correct. But people used to say, oh, you should have at least 10 times as many, people as you have independent variables. Or there used to be actually a formula like N, what was it? Like the number of 8 plus the number of variables times 5, something like that. I mean, there are all these like wacky rules of thumb that people use for multiple regression. I mean, none of them are like any magical, like, silver bullet for the sample size, but I think we can all agree that there probably is some sample size below which you would feel funny running a regression. And for different people and different scenarios, it might be different things. But if I said to you, I have 10 people in my sample and I've got, 3 independent variables, you'd probably tell me that's ridiculous, right? Okay. So we have the same kind of issue here in multi-level modeling, but the trick is we have a total number of observations, but we also have clusters, right? And so we really have to think about the sample size at a couple of different levels. So for example, I would say what's most salient in multi-level modeling, when we start to think about how big does my sample need to be to use multi-level modeling, the question is less about what's the total number of observations in my sample, and the question is much more about what's the total number of highest level units in my sample, right? So for example, if I have 5,000 people in my sample, but I only have 2 clusters, 2 schools or 2 states or whatever, should I run a multi-level model? What do you think? And what might be some alternate framework? And 2 clusters is a particularly interesting one. Like, what would you do? Let's say I've got 5,000 people. I don't know. 5,000 is a lot because I want to use schools as my example. So let's say it's okay. How many people are at E.O. Smith? I don't even know. Not 2,500 probably. No. All right. Well, whatever. I got 2,000 people and they're in 2 different schools. Should I run that as a multi-level model? No, probably not, right? And if I don't run it as a multi-level model, what are my options? What would you do? Yeah, I could just code. I could put in school as a fixed effect, right? I could put in school I could dummy code school, effect code school, however you want to code school, and I could put it into my model as a fixed effect. Because and I think one of the things you have to remember that we talked about early on when we talked about sort of multi-level models, remember what separates multi-level models from regular regression models? It's the random effects, the variance covariance structure. But the variance covariance structure comes about because we're adding these random effects to the model, right? And the random effects we're really kind of making an assumption that we have a random sample of whatever like clusters, units, whatever this is from a larger population. So when we have students within schools and we have, 30, 40, 50 schools, we're kind of assuming these schools are not the schools of interest. Remember, this goes back to like week 1 when we talked about gender, fixed effect, school, random effect. These particular 30 or 40 schools are not like the 30 or 40 schools that I am interested in because, like they're just a sample of a larger population of schools. And I want to use this sample of schools to sort of understand how things work in the larger population. But when you get down to 2 schools, right, the first thing is, again, at a certain point, like, you're getting 2 of it. I mean, I would argue like two of anything is probably not really a reasonable random sample of a larger population, right? And because there are only 2 schools, it kind of makes sense to think about this from a fixed effects framework, the same way we might think about differences as a result of gender or something like that. How do the parameters differ in this school versus this school, right? I mean, you can put school in as a predict, you could, again, the model could look just like a multi-level model, you just wouldn't put in any random effects. So you can have school as a predictor of the outcome, right? So 2 is not enough. No, is 3 enough? Probably no. I mean, I would argue less than 10 level 2 units, and you're pretty much, in my mind, not even on the board for multi-level modeling. Yeah. Yes, I would especially still not do multi-level, because isn't the idea of having random effects to generalize? And if you don't care about generalizing, shouldn't you just use fixed effects? Right? Like, because now because if I have 2 schools, I can literally compare school A and school B. And that's really, if you only have 2 schools, what you should be doing, right? You've got 2 schools and you can compare them. Multi-level is like, I have 2 schools. They're part of a larger universe of schools, and I'm going to use these schools to like generalize to this larger population of schools. But you really can't do that with 2 schools. What you got are 2 schools, and you can say, hey, what do these schools look like on average? How is school A different from school B? But like, to sort of say 2 schools represent a random sample from the whole universe of schools, I think doesn't make sense whether you're coming at it from a research or an evaluation perspective, right? So, I mean, obviously more is better. More is always better when it comes to sample size, yes? Mm-hmm. What'd you do? I mean, I have that happen all the time. So if I had 5 or 6 schools, I would put school in as a fixed effect. So I would, right, like dummy code each of them, or, I mean, there are different ways to do that kind of coding, but yeah, I would put school in as a fixed effect. So I've got like, I've been a part of lots of different studies, like where, for example, we had, 100 schools, let's say, but they were gathered across 4 districts, right? So you've got kids nested within schools, technically nested within districts, but we ran the model as a 2-level model, and we looked at, kids nested within schools, then district, because there were only 4 districts, we put district in as a fixed effect at level 2, right? And then, you can imagine, you could ask, like, does the treatment does the treatment differ by district, for example? So let's say you've got a code for treatment, you've got a treatment effect in the model, and then you've put in district, you could put a district by treatment interaction in too. I mean, you can still have it, you can still put in district, you can still put in interactions, but it's not actually a level of the model. So we put it in as a fixed effect. And when you're less than, again, like, is 10 the magic number? Would you really never do it with 9? I don't know. Different people would probably differ in terms of that, but certainly like 4, 5, 6, no, definitely not a multi-level model. And I would say, in my own mind, 10 is kind of like the rock bottom minimum below which I would just code as fixed effects and not put in as a level of analysis. And one of the things that we didn't talk about, when really last week I did this like drive-by on 3-level models, right? Do you remember where I showed you? It's just like another level with more notation and more tau matrices and all that. One of the things that I didn't tell you last week is that when you run a 3-level model, remember how we talked about restricted maximum likelihood and full maximum likelihood? What do you remember about the differences between restricted and full maximum likelihood? Nice. Well, okay. Yeah. And restricted maximum likelihood really should give us less biased estimates of our variance components. When we use full maximum likelihood, our variance components tend to be biased downward a bit. That's probably one of the most important reasons for using restricted maximum likelihood. And so restricted maximum likelihood performs far better when you have small sample sizes. And again, the salient sample size here is really the cluster size, that when we have a small number of clusters, we're much better off using restricted maximum likelihood. And I think I told you that there's sort of like an approximation. This gives you how much your variance components might be downwardly biased if you use FIML as compared to Dremel. J here is the number of clusters, and F is the number of fixed effects. So it's like the number of victors. So, again, you can imagine if you have a small number of clusters, like if you have like 10 clusters, even if you're estimating a small number of parameters, right? Then, you're going to see some, and you have to be some parameters, you're going to see a decent amount of downward bias, small number of clusters, and those are the places in which Dremel is really going to outperform FIML. If you have 1,000 clusters, it really doesn't honestly matter whether you use Dremel or FIML, because you're going to get basically the same estimates of the variance components. But it's when you're sitting in a place where you've got, especially like less than 50 clusters, or especially when you've got like less than 50 clusters, you're going to find that Dremel is going to really outperform FIML. Okay, well, here's the thing. Once you get into 3-level models, there is no Dremel. There's only FIML. You can't estimate 3-level models using Dremel. So this is another reason that you want to be careful about adding a 3rd level, because adding a 3rd level takes you from having Dremel as an option to deal with a small number of clusters to not having Dremel as an option, and that 3rd level is actually the highest level is going to be where we really need to be thinking about these sample size issues, right? So if I'm going back to my example, I've got 100 schools, I've got thousands of kids in 100 schools, and those 100 schools are from 6 districts. If I model that as a 3-level model, I now can't use Dremel. I can only use FIML, and I only have 6 districts. So like my variance components are likely to be severely downwardly biased. And if you haven't figured it out, we care a lot about those variance components in multi-level models. We spend a lot more time thinking about variances in multi-level than we did in like regression. So this is another reason that you want to be sort of really thoughtful about, how many clusters you're going to, what's like a minimum number of clusters. So rock bottom minimum, I would say, number of clusters to get you on the board, even for a 2-level model, is about 10. And I'll show you why in a second. So our questions that we want to think about in terms of sample size are like, how big does your sample need to be to use multi-level modeling? Like the first question is, how big does it need to be to even get to get convergence, to get the model? Because if you have too small a sample size, it's possible that you try to run this thing in R and it just doesn't even converge. So you don't even get an answer. So like the very small, like that's like, if you think about it, your very most minimal threshold is like, how big does it have to be to just get the model to run and give you results? Then the next threshold is, well, how many level 2 units do I need to get unbiased parameter estimates? Because like if my parameter estimates are really severely biased, I mean, that's not a good thing, right? That's a bad thing. And so we need to think about that. And then once we feel like, okay, I've got enough to run the model and to get unbiased estimates, then the next question is, am I adequately powered to detect the effect of interest? Yeah, does all that make sense? Okay, so if we want to get good estimates of our variance components, and by the way, I'm going to show you this as we go through, but the things that are hardest to get good estimates of are the variance components. You're going to see that it takes a smaller sample size to get good estimates of our fixed effects than it does to get good estimates of our variance components. And remember that we have sigma squared, which is our pooled within cluster residual variance, and then we have our tau matrix. We have our taus, which are really these, right? These between cluster variances, right? So for sigma squared, if you think about it, because sigma squared is this pooled within cluster variance, so it's, right, it's the residual within the cluster, pooled within the cluster, and then pooled again across clusters. The most salient sample size to get a good to get a good estimate of sigma squared is actually to have a decent number of people within clusters, which makes sense, right? So, for example, if you only have like 2 or 3 people within each cluster, you could imagine that again, that estimate of sigma squared might not be, as well estimated as if you had a couple hundred people per cluster. And again, we can have different numbers of people within different clusters. We don't have to have balanced designs. We can have unbalanced designs. But if all cluster sizes are small, you can imagine we're not going to get as good an estimate of sigma squared. So for sigma squared, to get a good estimate of sigma squared, it's really important to think about the number of people per cluster. But for tau, because this is about between cluster variance, and because it's about between cluster variance, what's really salient is the number of clusters, right? Because we're looking at the variability across clusters, and so it's a between cluster variance. So the most important thing to get a good estimate of taus is to have a decent number of groups so we can reliably estimate those variances. So again, if I only have 10 clusters, for example, and you're getting this tau matrix, right? That tau matrix is based on the variances that are actually generated using only 10 clusters, right? And because they're between cluster variances, the sample size for thinking about that tau matrix really, it isn't thousands, it's really 10. Do you follow what I'm saying? So it doesn't matter how many people you have in your sample in total or how many people you have per cluster, that really getting good estimates of tau and thinking about the tests for the variance components of tau are really, really dependent on the number of clusters that you have. And so the larger the number of clusters, the better you're going to be able to estimate tau. Yeah? Okay. So again, what's the minimum number of clusters? Well, way back when, Snyders and Bosker said, multi-level analyses require a bare minimum of 10 clusters. And, again, that was sort of made up, but seems kind of reasonable. And I'm going to show you, Moss and Hawks did a simulation study that actually would suggest that 10 is a pretty good minimum. But again, at such small sample sizes, that gets you a model, but we might still have bias in our estimates, right? And as I said, we can think about where could that bias lie? We could have bias in our fixed effects estimates. So when I say fixed effects estimates, I'm talking about the gammas, right? The parameters that we're interested in, or betas when it's a longitudinal model, but like our intercept, our slopes, right? Those pieces, which are often the things that substantive researchers are most interested in, those fixed effects, right? So we definitely don't want to have bias in our fixed effects. Where else could we have bias in a model? Well, we could have bias in the standard errors for those fixed effects. What do we do with standard errors again? We create confidence intervals and we use them for statistical tests, right? So if our standard errors are biased, what's that going to do? Yeah, exactly. It's going to throw off our statistical tests, right? So we're not going to get the right, we're not going to, we think we've set a type 1 error rate, but we don't actually have the type 1 error rate that we've set, right? Or we're going to get too many type 1 errors or type 2 errors. depending on the direction of the bias. So bias in the standard errors of the fixed effects, because that's what we use to determine statistical significance, that's also problematic, right? Assuming you want to do tests of statistical significance, which most people want to do. So bias in those standard errors is problematic. Then there are the variance components, right? And again, we've spent a lot of time thinking about the proportion of variance that's explained, and thinking about between cluster variance. We use those variance estimates a lot in multi-level modeling. So maybe they're not quite as important as the fixed effects estimates. And maybe, I guess if we were going to sort of say, like, what's the, like, where could you live with bias? Like, can't live with it in my fixed effects. Like, if I'm going to get biased parameters estimates, like, why do the study at all, right? Like, the wrong answer, bad, right? Who wants to run an analysis and get the wrong answer? Bad. Okay. Right answer in terms of parameters, but wrong answer in terms of tests of statistical significance. Okay, not as bad as getting the wrong answer, but still pretty bad, right? Okay, next up is, okay, I get the right answer and I get the right test of statistical significance for my fixed effects, but my variance components aren't estimated well. Well, again, given everything we've done this semester, maybe it's not as bad as the first two things, but it's still pretty bad, right? I don't want that. And then the last thing that Moss and Hawks talk about is, what about the standard errors for those variance components? Well, I don't care as much about the standard errors for the variance components at all, because I've spent the whole entire semester telling you I don't really trust those. But some people use standard errors for variance components. So that would be like the last piece of information that you could look at to see what's the bias in the standard errors of the variance components. But like, in my mind, yeah, okay, I don't really, like, whatever. I can live with, like, if I can get unbiased fixed effects, standard errors for the fixed effects, and unbiased variance components, I'm good, right? I can live with that. Yeah. Oh, that's okay. So Moss and Hawks did a really large-scale simulation study, which sort of stands to this day as a study that really guides researchers in terms of sample size requirements for multi-level studies. And what they found is that if you had at least 10 clusters, so at least 10 level 2 units, that the regression parameters and the level 1 variance component, so that would be like sigma squared, right, exhibited very little bias. So that's good, right? So I got 10 clusters and my parameter estimates are right. And my sigma squared is pretty much right. But the level 2 variance components were actually overestimated by about 25%. And the standard errors for all parameter estimates were underestimated. Well, what happens when a standard error is underestimated? What kind of error are you going to be more likely to make? Type 1 error or type 2 error? Are you going to say something is statistically significant too often or not often enough? Too often, right? Because remember that we are always taking, t-tests are always like, the numerators, like the parameter or whatever, divided by the standard error. So if the standard error is too small, then that ratio is going to be too big, and that's the ratio that we compare to the critical value. And so we're going to say something statistically significant too often. Okay, so like, again, so you can see why I say 10 is kind of the minimum. But 10 is not optimum, right? It's not optimal because we still have some issues. They found that with at least 30 clusters, that parameter estimates for the regression slopes and the level 1 and level 2 variance components were tended to exhibit very little bias. So, okay, so now my variance components are pretty trustworthy, and my fixed effects are pretty trustworthy, and the standard errors for the fixed effects also had very little bias. So those were kind of the three things that I said that I really cared about. So with 30 clusters, I'm in pretty good shape. On all of, like, I can get good parameter estimates, I can trust the statistical tests, and I can get trustworthy estimates of the variance components. But what I don't get with 30 groups is trustworthy standard errors for the level 2 variance components. And if you care about the standard errors for the level, if you believe in them and you care about them, then you need at least 100 clusters to get good estimates of the standard errors for the variance components, which again is just like another nail in the coffin for using standard errors of variance components for statistical significance testing. So like we already said that there are boundary issues, like there are problems with computing standard errors for variance components because of boundary issues. And but you know, again, like you really have to have a large number of clusters to actually have them be sort of functional for you. And let's face it, lots of times people don't have 100 clusters is a lot. Okay, so basically studies with small to moderate numbers of clusters might have a higher type 1 error rate for those level 2 variance components, which again, if that's the case, would lead you to thinking there's more between group variance than there really is. And you know, well, I've already said the second bullet, right? That sort of 10 gets you on the board, 30 puts you in much better shape in terms of getting reasonably unbiased estimates. And if you care about those standard errors, you need a boku clusters. There is, anyway. So any questions about any of this? Yeah. Sure. Well, like, you know, I spent all semester sort of arguing against using standard errors for the variance components. So, I mean, so I don't find that to be all that compelling, right? But there are people out there who do look at standard errors for variance components. And if you really were going to use standard errors for the variance components, I mean, to me, this is just I look at this as just another reason why we shouldn't trust the standard errors for variance components, right? Like, rather than like, when should you worry about getting 100 clusters? But having said that, it certainly is true that more clusters are better. Always, you know, like we always say that, right? Like, more is better. So, you know, if you have a choice between getting 30 clusters or 50 clusters, like 50 clusters is better than 30 clusters, right? So I don't think you have to worry about like this, oh, get 100 because of these standard errors. But, you know, more is definitely better, especially up to a certain point, right? And it does matter in terms, like how many clusters. Well, you'll see it's going to matter for power too. But like, if you have a really, really complicated model, you know, like if you know, there are certain models where people have like, you know, 10 different independent variables and they're putting in interactions among variables and like it's just a really complex model. Obviously, when I say 30 clusters, I'm thinking of like reasonably simple models. But like if you have a model where you've got like 20 different gammas in the model, 30 clusters is not a good number of clusters, right? So you should also be thinking about the number of parameters, the number of fixed effects that you're trying to estimate. So if you've got a really the more complicated the model you're trying to estimate, the more clusters you should definitely build in. And that's where that J minus F divided by J little formula that I just flashed up there comes into play. So yeah, 30 gets you on the board for sure, especially like with reasonably simple models. You know, you got an intercept, you got 1 or 2 slopes, whatever, you know, 30 is a good place to be. But if you've got a crazy big model, you know, you definitely want to be higher than 30. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's where, so if you think about it, that's where we have like, think about how this then applies to growth models, right? So I've sort of been framing this a little bit in terms of organizational models, but in growth models, let's assume it's a 2-level growth model. So we've got observations across time nested within person. So for person, right, we have, you know, we often have a decent number of people. Like I would argue 30 is not the right number. Like this entire study of Moss and Hawks was done with organizational data. So they were looking at I forget, I think they went as low as 10 for the number of people per cluster, the N sub J. So they looked at like 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, I believe, something like that. But they didn't look at having only like 3 or 4 observations per cluster, which if you think about like a standard growth model, we often have 3 or 4 or 5 time points per person, right? And so the total amount of data you have there, if you have 4 time points per person, and you only have 30 people, you actually only have 120 rows of data. You only have 120 observations. That's probably really not going to be enough. I mean, I would say for longitudinal data, you want to have generally want to have at least 50 people. And again, that's because you have very few observations per person. And if you think again about the interplay here, what's not going to be well estimated when you have a growth model potentially is that sigma squared, right? Because you have very few observations per cluster, but sigma squared is like your measurement error. So like, okay, I mean, that's not perfectly estimated. That's, I mean, not usually the biggest deal in the world. But we do in growth models care very much about those taus, right? The between cluster variance and the between cluster covariance often. So, we want to make sure that we have enough level 2 units to be able to estimate that well. So I would say rule of thumb, like 50 is probably rock bottom minimum for standard growth models. I'm certainly much more comfortable when I get closer to 100 for growth models. I mean, I think anything of 100 or better on growth models, you're in really reasonable shape. And again, this is where the sort of Fimmel-Remmel distinction becomes less important for growth models because you have a large number of clusters. And so, okay. All right, so any questions about sort of getting on the board with multi-level modeling and sort of minimal sample size requirements? So again, now that I'm going to switch gears toward power, just remember that now we're going to think about power, but everything that I just said about having enough sample size to actually run the models is still in play. So like if I do a power analysis and it says I only need three clusters, it's, 3 clusters isn't really enough to run the model, right? I mean, that would be a mighty big effect, by the way. Anyway, okay, power. So how much time have you spent talking about power in other classes? I don't actually know the answer to that. One class? At the end of regression. Okay, so what do you remember about power from the end of regression? What is power? Okay, yeah, best to think about power before we start the study. That's right. And what is power really all about? Yeah? Do we really know what we're saying? Well, that's what everything is all about. But yes, power is really about the power to detect an effect of a particular magnitude. So do I have adequate power to say that this is different from 0 if it is in fact different from 0? Or like, do I have the power to reject the null hypothesis if I should actually reject the null hypothesis, right? So that's what power is all about. But I think the thing that's really important to remember when you start thinking about power, and somehow I think this gets lost in the shuffle sometimes, is that it's all about, power is about the power to detect a particular effect or the power to reject a particular null hypothesis, right? So you can't just say like, do I have enough power for this model? Because then the question is, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by like, which effect are you trying to have? Like, which effect do you want to know if you have adequate power to detect? So, for example, a lot of times we do studies, intervention studies, right, in education, and so we always want to make sure that we're adequately powered. If we've got a treatment, we want to make sure we're adequately powered to detect a treatment effect, the treatment effect of interest. So, and then we have to ask we'll get to this in a minute, but we have to sort of say, well, what adequately powered to detect a treatment effect of what magnitude, right? But often, once you sort of, in the you design this study to make sure you have adequate power to detect this treatment effect of interest, but then people say, well, gee, does gender moderate the effect of treatment, or does the type of school moderate the effect of treatment? Or suddenly people start asking questions about like moderation. Are there variables? Like, does treatment vary as a function of, whatever, right? Pretest score or whatever. Well, okay, if I'm going to build in an interaction, then I should, theoretically, I'd like to be adequately powered to detect the interaction effect. That's a different number than being adequately powered to detect the main effect. And actually, interaction effects are underpowered when compared to main effects. So it takes more units to get adequate power to detect interaction effects than it takes to have adequate power to detect main effects. And that's, we won't go into that too much today, but it's just how it is. So, so the first thing you have to ask yourself is like, okay, what is the thing that I'm trying to power for, like to get adequate power to detect? What is that like focal? In this case, it's generally going to be a parameter. Like, what's that focal parameter of interest? And I could have, again, in my multi-level model, I could have 10 fixed effects in my model, right? Each of those fixed effects, you might think is going to have, if you wanted to make sure you have adequate power to detect each of those fixed effects, you'd literally have to think, what's the effect size I expect for each of those 10 fixed effects, and run a power analysis, for each of those 10 fixed effects, right? Because power is really dependent on that, like the magnitude of that effect. Yes.
Actual theory, I'm going to make it more applicable to that feels wrong.
Oh, I hope. Yeah, I mean, I hope that doesn't happen. I don't know. I mean, I think what often happens, I don't know that people adjust their theory to fit their sample size requirements. I think what happens more often, which is equally bad, but is that they adjust their projected effect size estimate to fit their sample size requirements. But I mean, luckily, I think people are often most interested. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think people, okay, I'll say this too. So this is sort of related. People generally power for the main effects, and then they look at the interactions. So they don't worry about the fact that they would need 10,000 maybe to look at a particular effect. They power for the main effect, and then they just go ahead and look at everything else anyway, which is, again, maybe not a good answer, but I do think that happens a lot. And that's what's really tricky, right? Because let's say you're doing an intervention study and you really would like to know if there are moderators of that intervention. That's a reasonable thing to want to know, but like maybe nobody's going to fund the research if it's like 10,000 people. And it's also very true that like until you know that the intervention works, it doesn't really matter what the moderators of the treatment are, right? So like the first step in a line of research is to show this intervention works. And then the next step is, for whom does it work? So the way that for a lot of like large scale federal studies, the way that moderational hypotheses are usually cast as sort of exploratory, underpowered hypotheses. So it's like, I'm adequately powered to detect this main effect. I'm also going to look at if there are moderators of this main effect, with the caveat that I know I'm kind of underpowered to do this. And so I think that's often the way it kind of plays out. All right. So just remember, power is to detect an effect, a particular effect of particular interest. And by the way, I just said the thing about like, oh, well, if you had 10 different parameters in the model, there would be, 10 different effects. But the reality is that there and that's true, but the reality is that there's usually a focal parameter of interest when you're running, you've got this study. And so imagine you have a whole bunch of covariates that you've put in the model. And those covariates are there to control for things like SES and prior knowledge and this and that and the other thing. And so they're there, as control variables. And the control variables serve a couple of different purposes, right? They sort of equate people across those things. And they also like eat up a bunch of the residual variance, which actually does give you more power, which is nice. But you don't really, if you think about it, you don't really care about whether you're adequately powered to detect the covariant effects of interest. They're there as control variables. So like you would normally not do a power analysis for each of your control variables because like they're there as helper variables, but there's a main focal effect of interest. That's the thing you're really interested in. That's the thing that you want to make sure that you power for. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. So the question was, you would use the predicted effect size for the focal variable after controlling for those other control variables. And yeah, that's exactly the parameter that you should be using as the focal parameter estimate of interest, which is sometimes difficult because you might not, how do you find effect sizes, by the way? Where do you get these effect sizes that you're going to use for the power analysis? Yeah, prior literature. So sometimes somebody else might have used the same control variables, and so that's great. So you kind of have a good estimate of what this focal effect might be after controlling for these covariates, but maybe nobody did. Maybe that's like your studies, like, man, nobody else ever controlled for this, and they should have. So then it makes it really hard for you to get, you guess is what you do, of course, you guess, but like you might not find in the prior literature a good estimate of like, what is this focal effect going to be after controlling for prior knowledge? But yeah, you should be thinking about that. Like that is the focal parameter you should be using because that's the one that, right, that's the effect that you're going to be estimating in your model, and that's the one that you want to be statistically significant. So you really need to be asking about, what's my focal effect? Yeah, what am I controlling for? What do I think the magnitude of this focal effect is going to be? So usually, even though there are bazillions of parameters in a model, we aren't actually literally running like 27 power analyses for each model because usually there's like, there's one or maybe there are two focal effects that we're most interested in that model. Does that make sense? Okay, so just to remind ourselves about how power works in a non-multi-level framework, power is dependent in a non-multi-level framework on three things. And one of them kind of breaks out into two things. But alpha, that's our type 1 error rate, right? We set our alpha level, like what's our traditional alpha? 0.05, right? That's how willing I am to make a type 1 error. What's a type 1 error again? I say that something's statistically significant when I shouldn't have, when the null hypothesis is true, right? So traditionally we set, for whatever reason, traditionally we set a type 1 error rate of 0.05. The second thing is sample size. And you might remember from other discussions of power analysis, and you'll see why in a minute, the bigger the sample size, the more power you have to detect an effect of interest. And sample size is like a huge driver of power in both single level and multi-level studies. And then the third thing that drives power is the effect size, because remember I said it's the power to detect an effect of a particular magnitude. So the question is, if I have an effect that's not zero, it's this big, will I find that effect is statistically significantly different from zero? That's really what we're doing when we're doing a power analysis. And so obviously, like you could imagine, if you have an effect that's not zero, but it's really, really close to zero, it's going to be much harder to reject the null hypothesis that it's zero than if you have an effect that is enormous and very different from zero. So like the further away you are from the null hypothesis, which is generally like that this effect is zero, right? The further away that you are from the null hypothesis that this effect is zero, the easier it is to reject the null hypothesis. And I'm going to kind of show you a little bit more about why that is the case in just a second. But let me just say, like, if we think about effect size from like a, sort of a t-test kind of a framework of like a difference between two, it could be regression too, but if we think about it as a difference between two groups, right, then how do we usually determine an effect size if we're thinking about the difference between two groups? Cohen. That's okay. Cohen, yeah, Cohen's D. Yeah, exactly. Well, and whether Cohen's numbers about small, medium, and large are right, who knows? But we often use Cohen's D. How do we compute Cohen's D? So it's like, so let's say it's the difference between, so it's the difference between divided by the standard deviation. Then like, what standard deviation? Well, technically it's actually the pooled standard deviation. So it's like this pooled standard deviation across the two groups, right? And get into more details about that. But basically, think about that, then there are really two pieces that really drive effect sizes. One is the mean difference between the two groups. So the bigger the mean difference, holding constant effect size. But the other piece is this standard deviation, this pooled standard deviation. So the bigger, and again, you can think of deviations, the square root of variance, right? It's really about sort of within group variance, which is in some sense like error variance or noise. So the smaller the pooled standard deviation, the bigger the effect size is, holding constant the mean difference, right? So there are sort of two ways to get a big effect size. One is to have a really big difference between the means. And even, in that case, even with a pretty big pooled standard deviation, you're going to get a big effect size. And the other is maybe there's a small difference between the means, but there's a really, like, the pooled within group standard deviation is small. And so there you get a big effect size because there is this small within group standard deviation. So that's why I say, there's three pieces, but this piece actually really kind of does break out into two different pieces. It's really about sort of this pooled within group error, right, or pooled within group variance, and the mean difference between the groups. Okay, so that's in a single level study. You with me so far? Okay, so you've probably all seen this before, right? This is our little power quad, like our little, I don't know, little power thing, right? We don't reject the null hypothesis. That's true. We have not made an error, okay, right? So the null hypothesis is that there is no difference, and I say there's no difference. That's good, right? If the null hypothesis is really that there is no difference, but I say that there is a difference, so I reject the null hypothesis when I should not have rejected it, that's when I make a type 1 error. And, again, assuming things are functioning correctly with our analyses, we control that type 1 error rate with our alpha. So we often set this at 0.05, right? On the other sort of, and we spent a lot of time, I feel like, in intro stat sort of talking about this, but then on the flip side, I could have a null hypothesis that's not true, so the difference is not exactly zero, but I fail to reject that null hypothesis. That's what we call type 2 error, which is often people use the symbol beta to show type, which makes it confusing because we use beta for lots of things, but sorry about that. I recognize that. I didn't make the rules. But that's type 2 error rate. And then the other option is the null hypothesis is not true, and I reject it, right? So it's the null hypothesis is not zero in the population, and I say it's not zero. So here just like up here, right, on the diagonal, I haven't made an error, and that's 1 minus beta. So these two things are going to add to 1, right? They're, I either make an error or I don't make an error, right? And so does anybody know what's the sort of standard that people set for power analysis? Like, what's the standard? Because power, again, is 1 minus beta. What's the standard? You're supposed to be powered at what level? 0.8, right? That's exactly right. So sort of standard for power is 0.8, which actually means that your type 2 error rate is 0.2, right? Which if you stop and think about is kind of weird. Because that means you're 4 times as willing to make a type 2 error as you are to make a type 1 error. Why is that? Think about that? No, I mean, that's the way people do it, but it doesn't actually necessarily make, I would argue you shouldn't necessarily just default to the standards. You should be thinking about what's the more egregious kind of error to make in your situation, a type 1 or a type 2 error, right? And then be sort of thinking about how you want to use that to inform your power analysis. I personally think, again, I think 0.8 is pretty low. Right? If you think about it, think about a study. IES gives me money. I've powered my study at a 0.8, right? Because I powered it at 0.8, they gave me money because 0.8 is the magical number. Of course, I set my alpha at 0.05 because I wouldn't dare set my alpha at something other than 0.05. God help you. Maybe 0.01 somebody would be okay with, but 0.10, my gosh, they're definitely not going to fund you with an alpha of 0.10. I guarantee you that. Okay, so I power for my study, right? They gave me $3 million to conduct this 4-year study of my intervention, which I powered at 0.8. And at the end of the $3 million and the 4 years, I didn't find an effect. Crap. But there's a 20% chance that maybe there is an effect, and I just wasn't adequately powered to detect it. I don't know. I don't feel good about that. What do you think? And trust me, when you don't find the effect after $3 million in 4 years, they're unlikely to give that money to somebody else to try to detect that effect later, right? Oh, it's just, to me, it seems really strange, right? Like, I spent all this time and money, and I'm like willing to take a 20% chance that the effect of the magnitude that I am, that's the other thing, the effect of the magnitude that I am a priori predicting it will be, like, so it's not just like, right, like I'm saying I think the effect size is going to be like 0.4 standard, like I think it's going to be about 0.4 standard deviation units. If I power at 0.80, I'm saying I'm willing to take a 20% chance that even though in the population that difference really is 0.4 standard deviation units, which is what I theoretically think it is, that I will still find nothing. I will miss it. No, it just blows my mind. I don't know why we use 0.8. I don't like 0.8. I like 0.9. But like, again, because a lot of people don't think about this, they may come, if you use 0.9, the feds may come back and be like, but everybody uses 0.8, so lower your sample size. So you use 0.8 because how do you get a power of 0.9? You up your sample size, right? I don't know. Seems very weird to me. And like, why am I willing to take a 20% chance of being wrong here? And like a 5% chance of a type 1 error. Why isn't it 10 and 10? Why don't I use an alpha of 0.1 and a power of 0.9? Like, maybe that would make a lot more sense. But if you try to do that, people be like, you're crazy. So don't say, well, Betsy told me to do it. Well, Pam, you bring up a really good point. Every day,
Sorry.
every week that I get ready to do this power analysis, any power analysis lecture, I think to myself, well, the whole power analysis thing is predicated on like using p-values, which everybody's like, hey, you know, p-values are not the be all and end all, and I believe that too. But like, you can't really do a power analysis without thinking. I mean, not in this way anyway. There are other ways to do power analyses technically, but the way we're talking about power analysis right now, I mean, most power analyses are predicated on I care about the p-value, which like I feel like we shouldn't care about so much. So I'll tell you this. I think power analysis is just a big game. Like, I'm not, I mean, I can do it. I'm pretty good at the game, but it's all kind of a big game. So, and I'm not saying it's not useful in certain ways, but still kind of a big game. All right. So I digress enough about the whole thing, but you can see the trouble that we have, some of these rules. Okay, so now let's think about this like a little bit more about what we're really talking about when we're talking about power. And right now, this is just like, again, this is nothing even multi-level here. This is power in general. So, you know, we're used to thinking about in statistics class, but this first curve is not shaded. One that is at the top. This is the distribution under the null hypothesis, right? And every time we look at t distributions, like in quant one class, remember, you would look up like, oh, the t value, like a t value of this, is it critically, like, is that a critical value? You know, is that above the critical value of t with this degrees of freedom? All of that is based on what does this t distribution look like under the null hypothesis? And the t distribution under the null hypothesis is the t distribution that assumes that the null hypothesis is true. So it assumes that the difference, let's say it's a mean difference kind of thing, it assumes that the difference is 0. So that's the t distribution that you see in all of the stats books that, you know, we see the pictures of and we see the critical values for. That's this guy. Okay, but there's also another distribution, and that's the distribution under the alternative hypothesis. And again, this is where we need to have an effect of some magnitude. So let's say I think that the difference between, you know, I think that the difference is going to be 0.4 standard deviation units, right? Whatever it is, I've got this effect size. I think the difference is going to be of this magnitude. Well, if you think about that, I'm saying, I think the difference is going to be of this magnitude in the population. But just like there's sampling error around a mean of like a difference of 0, because that's really what this is, right? This whole thing is telling me like, well, if it's 0 in the population, I'm not always going to get 0. I'm going to get, sometimes I'm going to get a little less than 0. Sometimes I'm going to get a little more than 0. But like, I'm going to say it needs to be pretty far, like I'm going to set some sort of a value like 0.05 and say, you know, you look at this distribution and say, I'm going to put the cuts in a place where only 5, like if I get a value that big, like less than 5% of the time, would that come from a distribution in which it really was 0 in the population, right? That's just to remind ourselves of what the heck this distribution is. This is the sampling distribution around the null hypothesis, right? So with a one-tailed test, right, I might set my 0.05 up here. With a two-tailed test, I might have 0.025 on either side, right? But it's also true that if it's not 0 in the population, if there is some number that's not 0 in the population, there's also a sampling distribution around that number. And that, too busy now. This is what this distribution is. This is the distribution under the alternative hypothesis. So the effect size is 0.2 in the population. I won't always get like if the true effect size is 0.2, I'm not always going to get a 0.2 in my study. I mean, that's the problem. Herein lies the problem, right? If the true effect size is 0.2, sometimes I'll get a 0.2, something less than 0.2, sometimes I'll get something more than 0.2. I'm going to get a distribution, a sampling distribution around the true effect. And that is what this distribution under the alternative hypothesis is all about. Right? With me so far? Okay. So then power is really, so here I've got critical value, like my, critical T or whatever. So here, under the null hypothesis, if you do these, right, this is where the difference was 0, but because this was above the critical value, right, on this distribution, I'm going to say that there's a difference when there isn't a difference, right? So in this red, this is like where I'm going to be making type 1 error because from my original null distribution. It's the piece that lies above the critical value, even though whatever I got was actually from the distribution where the null hypothesis was true. With me? Whereas, if the alternative hypothesis is true, if this what's called a non-central T distribution, this is my non-central T distribution here. Here's still my critical value. And this piece right here, this is actually the power. This is the proportion of the non-central T distribution that lies above the critical value. And the type 2 error rate is this part, the proportion of the non-central T distribution that lies below the critical value. So like in this case, we probably do have something like 8, let's say. And does that make sense to everybody? So to maximize power, what we really want is we want for these distributions to be like as sort of non-overlapping as possible, right? And how would we get these distributions to be as non-overlapping as possible? Well, what drives sort of the shape of this, or sort of the width, if you will, right? The shape of the sampling distribution. Because again, this is all about the sampling. This is like about the sampling distribution. Remember, the standard error is the standard deviation divided by the square root of n, right? And the standard error is the standard deviation of this sampling distribution. So the standard error is actually the standard deviation of this thing. So yeah, the bigger the n, the smaller the standard error is, which is the standard deviation of this sampling distribution, right? So the standard deviation of the sampling distribution is getting smaller and smaller. And so you can imagine if I had a huge n, I might get something like this where I've got these super narrow standard deviations. So even a little tiny mean difference is going to cause there to be basically no overlap between the two sampling, between the central and the non-central sampling distribution, which is going to give me a lot of power. So the first thing is like n, because it makes the standard deviation of the sampling distribution tighter, so I can detect smaller mean differences. The other thing that gives me more power, obviously, is if I move, but the mean difference, it's really where the peak of these distributions is, right? So the other way to maximize power is to basically have the center of those distributions be pushed further out from each other. And that's what the mean difference is, right? The bigger the mean difference, the more pushed out they are. Does everybody follow? Does that make sense? So far we haven't done anything multi-level. But are you with me? Is this all a review? Did you remember all of this? No. Okay, so good. So it was good we reviewed it. Okay. Okay, so this term I used, I said something about a non-central distribution. The non-central t distribution is the distribution when the alternative hypothesis is correct. By the way, this is one of those words where I remember being a grad student, and sort of like orthogonal for all of you. I remember being a grad student and hearing people talk bandy about stuff about like non-centrality parameters, and I had no freaking clue what they were talking about. And when I finally figured it out, I was like, that's it? So I'm going to tell you that the non-central, that other curve that I drew, that's the distribution under the alternative hypothesis, that's the non-central t distribution. And it doesn't have the exact same properties, by the way, as the central t distribution. But anyway, if you have enough degrees of freedom, it ends up being at least sort of almost, approximately normal, whatever. And so the non-central distribution is the sampling distribution you create when the alternative hypothesis is true. And the non-centrality parameter that people make reference to is just basically the degree of difference between your null hypothesis and your alternative hypothesis. So it's a way of expressing how different your null and alternative hypotheses are. So the non-centrality parameter for like tests that we're going to think about, like just in regression, for example, let's say this beta is expressing the true mean difference between two groups. So imagine like I have a treatment group and a control group, and the control group is coded 0 and the treatment group is coded 1, right? And so this beta would actually, and imagine you run a regression, and so beta is giving you the difference between the two groups. I mean, you could also run a t-test, and it could just literally be the mean difference between the two groups, but that might seem weird to call it beta, but it would still be, we could still call it beta here. And so this is just the mean difference between the two groups, divided by, oh wait, let me just, it is the hypothetical. One thing I just want to say is it's the hypothetical, it's the true, it's the true mean difference between the two groups. Because right now we're like in the world of we're in the land of, let's imagine what the true mean difference is. So I don't know what the true mean difference is, right? I'm doing all of this before I've gotten any data. This is a power analysis. So I'm like, what do I think the true mean difference is going to be? And that's what this is. Now, your best estimate of what the true mean difference is might actually be somebody's observed mean difference from a prior study. But I just want to be clear that this is what I think the mean difference is in the population. So technically, I can never actually observe this thing. I'm just guessing at it. You know what I mean? Okay. I'm going to take that, and I'm going to divide it by the standard error of the standard error of that difference. And again, that standard error is going to be a function of the standard deviation and the sample size, right? I mean, for differences, it's a little bit more complicated than just the standard deviation divided by the square root of the sample size, but the basic general principle holds. It's going to be a function of these two things. So the non-centrality parameter is just the ratio of the true difference between the two groups to the standard error of the estimated difference between the two groups. That's it. Okay. All right. That concludes our review of power in a single level study. So you can see, maybe, back here for a second, our picture, you can really see what's driving power, right? Obviously, alpha is driving power because that determines where I put the critical value. So if I see it better, if I set alpha higher, if I set alpha here, then obviously my power is going down because I have less on this side or on this side, right? If I set alpha over here, power's going up, right? Okay, so that's an easy way to change power, but let's just hold alpha constant at 0.05 right now. Remember what I said, the mean difference has an impact on power because the mean difference is really pushing the center of these two distributions apart. And the standard error, which is the standard deviation of these distributions, like that influences power because that's actually, right, like tightening these distributions or making. So those are really, and the sample size, right? The sample size, well, the standard error is the standard deviation of the sampling distribution, and the sample size is going to really be the thing that most impacts that standard error. Although technically, you might be able to come up with other ways to decrease the within group standard deviations without changing your sample size. How could you do that? Imagine you're doing a treatment study and you have no control over your sample size. How could you decrease the within groups? So, because remember, I said like standard error is really a function of like the standard deviation divided by the square root of the sample size. So the easiest way to change this thing is to change the square root of the sample size. But holding that constant, how could you change the within group standard deviations? Yeah. Yeah, that's actually one of the ways that we get power is when we put in covariates, this within group, it's really the within group or the error variance technically. And so by adding covariates, we can increase power. Absolutely. So we add good covariates that decrease the error variance, that increases power. Right? We could block. So for example, instead of like, you know, I've got all elementary school kids, and instead of, if you look at, you know, if you just compare all elementary school kids over here to all elementary school kids over here, you're going to have a lot more variance than if you look at like first grade kids versus first grade kids, or you block on grade. Okay, yes. So there are ways sometimes, this is harder to affect. Okay, so done. Yeah. Yeah, so this is right here. This is my non-central distribution. And this is my non-centrality parameter down there, which if you look at it, is actually kind of centered around the non-central distribution. Or it's sort of, yeah. But so I think the important thing though is this is the non-central distribution, this is the central distribution. The non-centrality parameter is really when we're going to take our guess about what the mean difference is, right? Divided by, again, the standard error. That's really what we're talking about for the non-centrality parameter. 10.5, no, keep me. Okay, that's really bad. So, before we take a break, let's just talk about a couple of things. Okay, so now you know about power for non-multi-level studies. But we got to think about a couple of other things when we think about multi-level studies. Actually, okay. I thought I added a couple extra slides. Do you have a couple extra slides in there? Maybe I'm. Okay, well, all right. Well, that's a big jump. So what do we have to think about though when we do a multi-level study? I said the things that we're thinking about are like sample size. What does sample size mean in a multi-level study? Which sample size? Number of clusters? Number of people per cluster? Oh, no, right? We don't just like what's going to be most salient for the power in a multi-level study is not going to, we don't have just like, oh, sample size is n, right? We have the number of people per cluster, and then we have the number of clusters. And also remember that the interclass correlation coefficient, what does that tell us about? It tells us about the between cluster variance, right? The proportion of between cluster variance, which really tells us, again, remember, the higher the ICC, the more similar people within a cluster are to each other, / the more different clusters are from each other, because we take the tau, remember the ICC is, just think about a totally unconditional model again. It's tau naught, well, it's tau naught naught plus, divided by tau naught naught plus sigma squared. So the sigma squared is about within cluster variance, right? And tau naught naught is about between cluster variance. And this gives us the ICC. So if all of our units were independent of each other, what would our tau naught naught be? There's really no, like clustering doesn't have an effect. People are really truly independent of each other. What would tau naught naught be? Under like complete independence. We've talked about this before. Would be 0, right? So an ICC of 0 means that you basically have complete independence, that there's no, like what that means is cluster doesn't help to explain any of the variance in the data. So knowing which cluster people are in doesn't explain any of the variability in the data. So that means people are independent of each other. Like people within a cluster, remember another way I said you can think about the ICC is it's kind of like the average correlation between two people within a cluster. So an ICC of 0 says two people within a cluster are no more similar to each other than two people from two different clusters. All right. So remember when we talked about N effective? Again, now this is we're going full circle back to like week 1 of this class. Do you remember when we talked about the effective sample size? And I said the effective, like the real sort of true effective sample size you have is a function of the average, the number of people per cluster and the ICC. Do you remember that? And I said, like, think about an ICC of 1. Let's do the opposite. Did this back in the ICC is 1. Well, that means the within cluster variance is 0, right? That means there's no variability within a cluster. Every unit within the cluster is the same, which means I really only need 1 unit per cluster, because getting more units per cluster doesn't tell me anything new. Everybody's redundant with everybody else, right? When the ICC is 1. When the ICC is 0, everybody's independent. Well, in regular old, stats, when we make the assumption of independence, we're making the assumption that the ICC is 0. But the ICC in a multi-level model isn't 0. It's also not 1. It's somewhere between, luckily. I mean, that would be dumb, right? Because then you also don't need a multi-level model when the ICC is 1, because you could just get rid of the lower level and analyze things on level 2. But like the ICC is going to be somewhere in between here. The closer the ICC is to 0, the more your sample resembles an independent sample. Like each person is contributing maybe not a whole person's worth, but closer to a whole person's worth in terms of size. And the closer your ICC is to 1, the more the observations within a cluster resemble each other. So the less independent information you get from each person or each unit in the cluster. Do you see what I mean? So the ICC is going to have a huge impact on our power, because if the ICC were 0, I could just do a regular old power analysis. I wouldn't have to do a multi-level power analysis at all. But as the ICC creeps up, I'm getting less and less information, less and less unique information from each person in my study. So the ICC ends up being this super important parameter that I need to know for power analysis in the multi-level study. So, and a larger ICC is going to mean that I need more data. But if I want to sort of limit the if I want to sort of limit the effect of the ICC, I can have smaller samples and more groups, right? So if you imagine I have like a lot of groups and each has a very small sample size, then the effect of the ICC in terms of the N effective is going to be much smaller because I have small numbers of people within groups. But if I have just a few groups and I have tons of people within each group, then the higher the ICC, sort of like the more information that I'm losing. So anyway, so an ICCs vary across dependent variables. So there is no, like, it's not the ICC for the study, it's the ICC for the variable of interest. And we kind of saw that because we saw that we could do ICCs for covariates, right? All right. So I'm gonna say one more thing and then we'll stop for break. So when I think about a multi-level, when I think about this multi-level model, and I think about doing power for a multi-level model, I need to think about what's the average cluster size at level 1? So what's the average number of people per cluster? What's the average number of clusters? So this is going to be like, before we said we needed to think about sample size, right? We said, oh, we got to think about N. But now I need to think about, like, what's the average number of people per cluster? What's the average number of clusters? And what's the ICC, which tells me about the dependence of observations within cluster. And all of these things, all of these three elements are going to work together to kind of determine what the sample size requirements are. And then I'm also going to need to know still about effect size and obviously. So this is where power analysis for multi-level model gets a bit more complex. So on that note, we'll take a quick break. I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes. Let's be back in 10. And then I'll show you how to do power analyses for multi-level. All right.
I brought us hundreds of them. Luxurious time. pay attention, take notes. Yeah. I don't know, but just do. Yeah. Now. When I was like, I explained to him that like, some people are weird, like. Whatever. And I'm like, I'm trying to make this. Like,
Yeah.
we want to make decisions.
Yeah, yeah. I guess that's some direction, saying do what we can. I guess we do. Yeah.
I just don't feel comfortable like.
Yeah, I think if it's clear that there's a start, then,
Just like when I get myself a gift of that.
but does that mean that we
It's a weird
add that for people who would have already been, yeah, like who already have more sleep units when they're 2 or 3? Add those if it's clear. I feel like, yeah, like just be consistent. Yeah. Okay, so
But I
then,
guess that one, it ended and I like. Yeah. I guess it was like jump.
yeah,
It's like,
I think that makes sense. We could go on for,
I know, and I know that like Kaylee messaged me, like now to pick you up.
Yeah. I think, okay, so deleting now, like, yeah, I saw your message. Oh, did we ask?
All right.
Stick with that. Like, even tell.
Four.
Hey,
Okay.
just
I'll
check in
about.
Yeah, totally works.
Do you know?
What time do you want to start?
I need to, like, can I take it a couple days earlier or would it have to be that day?
That day I was kind of, you had the thing, right?
I'm pregnant.
You're right.
We're like, no problem.
Well, there are 2 people who have early
Sure.
final things.
I know.
You're looking good for me.
Thank you.
Anyway,
8.5 months now.
yeah. So, Friday before now? All right. So back to work. So I just want to, this is just a definitional slide, but it'll be helpful because we're going to talk about these different types of trials. So power analysis, I mean, again, because you have to be powering for a particular effect, often we're using power analysis to think about treatment effects or effects of interventions. So there are 3 different types of randomized trials that are multi-level in nature. So like you've all heard people talk about randomized trials, right? Okay, but those are single level. So there are 3 types of multi-level randomized trials, which by the way are probably more common than just your simple, simple randomized kind of trial. Cluster randomized trial, and this is important, these are important terms to know because I do use these terms on the homework and they imply a particular kind of data structure. So in a cluster randomized trial, individuals are randomized in groups, which means the group is randomized, not the individual. So an example of this would be, I've got kids within classrooms and the classrooms are randomly assigned to treatment and control, right? You can't, it's really hard to like randomly assign, well, it depends on what the intervention is, but if it's like something the teacher's doing, right? It's like some sort of a teacher thing, it's really, you can't randomly assign kids within teacher to treatment and control. So you randomly assign the teacher or the classroom to treatment and control. And then it's all of the kids in the class are in the same condition, either the treatment or control condition, right? Contrast that to a multi-site randomized trial. In a multi-site randomized trial, we actually randomize within the cluster. And so that would be something like within each classroom, kids are randomly assigned to treatment or control. That could work for something like a technology intervention where certain kids get, let's say all kids have, laptops in the school and certain kids get a certain app or certain enhancement on their laptop. So like half of the kids in the class have this enhancement on their laptop and the other half don't. But probably more commonly, you see multi-site randomized trials often within like healthcare settings. So you've got hospitals, let's say, that are doing, like they've got, hospitals are doing some sort of a treatment, like it's some sort of a cancer treatment or something. And then as a patient comes in who has this type of cancer, they're randomized to be in the treatment or the control. But the hospital is the site, and people are being randomly assigned within the site, which is the hospital, the treatment and control. So a lot of medical studies use multi-site studies because they actually are randomizing within each site to treatment and control, whereas in educational settings, it's really common to be using the cluster randomized trial because, there are often a lot of interventions where you couldn't actually randomize within the classroom, for example. So does everybody understand the distinction there? Yeah, exactly. So in a multi-site, in both cases, I've got multiple clusters, right? But in the multi-site, I'm going to randomly assign people within the cluster. And then, so you could think about a multi-site study as almost being like, I've got a little randomized study within each site. And then I've got replications of that randomized study across sites. And that's why it's called a multi-site study. Whereas in a cluster randomized trial, the entire cluster is randomly assigned to treatment or control. And so I have like assignment is really happening at the cluster level, Okay. So those are two very different types of, again, both are multi-level because in both cases I have a cluster, but in one case I'm assigning within the cluster, that's multi-site. In the other case, I'm assigning the cluster to treatment or control, that's the cluster randomized trial. And then of course you can put both of these things together, and in schools we usually do. We have, most of the studies that I've been involved with that are like IES funded studies are multi-site cluster randomized trials. So we are randomly assigning classrooms within the school, right, to treatment and control. So at the classroom level, it's a cluster randomized trial, but I didn't say that right, but there's a cluster randomization to it because kids within classes are all assigned to treatment or control. But there's a multi-site element to it because then classrooms are randomly assigned within a school. But now to pull that off is actually a 3-level model if you think about it. So you've got kids nested within classrooms, nested within schools. Everybody in the classroom is assigned to treatment or control. So that makes it like a cluster randomized trial, but then you have different classrooms within schools assigned to either treatment or control. Like right now, we're doing a study with like Mike Coyne and Brandy, and we randomly assigned, and actually we blocked it because we had different grade levels, but if there are 2 first grades in a school, or if there are 4 first grades in a school, let's say, 2 of those first grades are randomly assigned to treatment, 2 of those first grades are randomly assigned to control. So that, actually, did we do that? Well, that's what we were going to do. I can't now. We may have changed the design. We've changed it so many times, but that's the idea. 2 are right. We got random assignment at the classroom level, but then you've got replications across schools. Okay. Yeah, well, the first one is just a 2-level, right? So it's just cluster randomized. So I've got like, you know, in the example I gave, I've got kids within classrooms and the classrooms are randomly assigned, but I didn't say anything about school, right? So like I didn't put school in the model in that one. Or I've got kids within schools and schools are randomly assigned, for example. But often, you know, again, often in education, what we really have are we have kids within classrooms within schools. So that would be like a multi-site cluster randomized trial. You could also have a multi-site trial that doesn't have that cluster randomization. You could have 3 levels and assign at the first level, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We're going to just talk about these. These are the major 3. So these are the 3 we're going to talk about. Okay. So, yeah. Classrooms are randomized. That's right. So the cluster is randomized. It's like a combination of the first 2 is really what this multi-site cluster randomized is. So it's just like a cluster randomized, except for now I've got multiple sites, and at each site I've got cluster random, right? Like, so I've got like the multi-site aspect is that I've got different clusters within a site randomized, but still the cluster part is that the people within the cluster are still all randomized to the same condition. Okay, so we're first going to talk about cluster randomized trials. So in a cluster randomized design, again, power is a function of alpha, the effect size, the cluster size, as we started to talk about this before break, the number of clusters, and the intra-class correlation. So actually, I did say all of that. Break. This is just a reminder of something we talked about the very first week, that design effect, remember? I started to talk about this before the break. Remember how we talked about the design effect tells us about the relative efficiency of the sample design, and it tells us by how much we should be adjusting the standard error because of design features. So a design effect, remember the design effect was this design effect, the design effect. And it's just for this formula 1 plus the intra-class correlation coefficient times the average number of people per cluster minus 1, like the average cluster size. So you can see here that this really tells us about how the ICC, right, and the sample size work in combination to really sort of determine the efficiency of the design. So the bigger, so again, holding the ICC constant, the bigger the sample size, the bigger the deft, which means, like, again, the more the standard errors have to be adjusted, the more not, like, the more this is going to sort of deviate from a traditional design where we assume everything's independent. And holding the sample size constant, the bigger the ICC, the bigger the design effect is going to be. So design effects of 1 mean that our design is functioning like a simple random sample. The bigger the design effect gets, the worse it is. And I think I showed you these, remember? Way back when I showed you sort of what does the design effect look like as a function of the ICC and the cluster size. And you can see that if you have a lot of people per cluster, even very small ICCs will cause problems in terms of the efficiency of the design. And again, the root design effect is just the square root of the design effect. It tells you by how much you should be correcting the standard error. Again, this is just kind of a review of the things that we talked about in week 1, but they kind of come into play again because these are all the same kinds of ideas. Okay, the root design effect, again, you can see here is just the square root of the design effect. Talk about that. Okay, so now imagine, okay, here's our group effect multiplier, our design effect. Here's an intra-class correlation coefficient, and here is like the randomized group size. So this is like the number of people per cluster, the average number of people per cluster. And how big does this design effect get? And you can see if the intra-class correlation coefficient is 0, it doesn't matter how many people per cluster you have, the design effect is always 1. So no problems, right? But with, let's just say with an interclass correlation coefficient of 0.1, which is not huge, if I have an average of 10 people per cluster, my design effect is 1.38. If I have 50 people per cluster, my design effect is 2.43. And if I have 200 people per cluster, my design effect is 4.57. So what this is showing, again, is that, like, you know, the efficiency of my design is not just a function of the interclass correlation coefficient. It's not just a function of, obviously, the number of people per cluster. It's really these two things in combination that are really determining sort of the efficiency of my design. So the lesson here, by the way, is that one way to sort of control the impact of an ICC is to have fewer people within clusters. So, like, if you design a study where you only have like a couple people per cluster, an ICC, like if you have 10 people per cluster, right, an ICC of 0.1 is not going to have nearly as much of an impact as if you have 200 people per cluster. Okay, well, let's think about what that means from a study design perspective. That means it would be much better for me to collect lots of clusters with very few people in them, right? Like just say we're taking 1,000 people. It's much better to have 200 clusters, each with size 5, than to have 5 clusters, each with size 200, even though the sample size is the same. So it's really not about the overall sample size. It's really about how it breaks out in terms of the number of people per cluster and the number of clusters. Now, having said that, I totally acknowledge that it's far more expensive to run a study with 200 clusters of size 5, right? Because, like, if imagine clusters are schools, and now I'm saying, oh, just get 5 kids per school and go to 200 different schools. That's going to give you a much more efficient design than having, you know, 5 schools with each with 200 people, right? But again, that's why we do all of this. That's why we think about this power analysis, right? And we think about, well, like, how big are the clusters going to be? So how many clusters do I need to have then, given the size of the cluster and the ICC? So when we're designing the study and we're designing the sample, we want to think about, like, what's the number of individuals per randomized group? What's the cluster size? How many groups are we going to be able to randomize? Again, we're talking about cluster randomized trials here. So how many groups can we randomize into treatment and control? And what proportion of groups should we randomize to treatment and control? And then obviously the ICC, as I said before, is going to play a role. And one way that we can get some power benefits is if we can find good covariates to kind of explain some of that within cluster variance, some of that error variance. By the way, let's just talk really briefly about the proportion of groups randomized to treatment and control. Holding the overall number of groups constant, like let's say you say, you know, I can only get 50 groups. I can only get 50 clusters. Anybody have an idea what's going to optimize your power? How many should I assign to treatment? How many should I assign to control? 25 and 25, right? So if for a fixed sample size, like a fixed number of groups, you're always best off just equally distributing to treatment and control. But here's an important caveat that you should think about when you're thinking about designing your own studies. That's true, but sometimes we're in a different situation where, like, let's say the treatment is very, very expensive or very, very cumbersome, and I can only actually afford to have 25 treatment groups. That, if you can only afford 25 treatment groups, is your power optimized by having 50 groups total? No, you should get more control groups is better. Now, again, it's not a linear relationship. There is a point at which, like, there's sort of, you know, the benefits of adding another cluster are relatively minor, but like if you can only get 25 treatment groups, you're better off having like 100 groups total, 25 treatment and 75 control, than you are having only 50 groups. You can actually get a benefit from having more control groups. Again, up to a certain point. You've got 25 treatment groups and you've got 1 million control groups. Like, that's really not probably any better than 25 treatment groups and 1,000 control groups. So there's sort of like an upper asymptote to all of that. But so from now on, we're going to assume, and optimal design is going to assume that your equally distributing across treatment and control groups, okay? But again, if there are times when you might not do that. All right. The minimum detectable effect size, I actually, this is a way that I prefer to do my power analyses, is to think about the minimum detectable effect size. And the minimum detectable effect size is the smallest true effect. So it's the smallest effect size that has a particular level of power for a given, for like a given level of statistical significance. So instead of saying like, how many people or how many groups do I need to get a power of 0.8 with an effect size of 0.3, this kind of flips the whole logic on its head a little bit and says, hey, like if I have 200 clusters, each of size 10, what's the smallest effect size I could detect with a power of 0.8? So rather than trying to estimate the power for a given effect, I say, I'm going to hold power constant at 0.8. What's the lowest effect I could detect with a power of 0.8? And that's what the minimum detectable effect size is. So it's the smallest true effect that the research study could detect with, a given sort of level of power. So for example, going back to that table that I showed you, if I have, like here are the number of schools that are randomized, again, cluster randomized trial, okay? The number of schools that are randomized to treatment and control, assuming equal numbers in each group. Here are the number of students per school, and this is the minimum detectable effect size. So higher power, by the way, means lower minimum detectable effect size, because this is telling me like, oh, I could, like right here, this is saying if I had 20 students per school and 10 schools randomized to treatment and control, the minimum effect size I could detect would be 0.56. Follow the logic? Okay. But if I had 120 students per school and I still only have 10 schools randomized to treatment and control, the minimum detectable effect size would be 0.46. But what do you notice when you sort of go along here? It gets smaller, but it doesn't get a lot smaller, does it? And it seems like it's kind of bottoming out at 0.46. So like whether I have 100 or 120 students per school, my minimum detectable effect size is the same. So I'm not, like you can see, even after from 80 to 120, my minimum detectable effect size dropped by 0.01. So you can see here that like, if I only am randomizing 10 schools, there's basically like a lower limit to my minimum detectable effect size. So like I can only get the power so high with 10 schools randomized to treatment and control. Now, contrast that with, I've got 20 students per school, but I randomized 10 schools, 20 schools, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 schools. See how as I add schools that I'm randomly assigning to treatment and control, you can come through. So my minimum detectable effect size is dropping, right? And you can think about this again, like 10 schools with 100 students per school, that's like 1,000 students. Here I've got 20 students per school with 50 schools, that's also 1,000 students. Here my minimum detectable effect size is 0.23. Here my minimum detectable effect size is 0.46, literally twice as big. Same number of students, right? Okay, so that's kind of the point there. All right, so why does that happen? Well, here's the formula for the standard error, which again, remember, when everything in like statistical significance is driven by standard error, because we take the mean difference, right? Or we take the effect divided by the standard error of the effect. So imagine gamma naught 1 is again, it's cluster randomized. So gamma naught 1 is going to be my treatment effects, the difference between the treatment and control groups. So in the numerator, I'd have the difference between the treatment and control groups. And in the denominator, this would be how I would compute my standard error. And 4, by the way, might seem really weird. Why is that 4 there? Well, the 4 is there actually because technically it's this. Half of my students are in the treatment group, half of my half of my clusters are in the treatment group, half of my clusters are in the control group. So technically it's J times 0.1 times 1/2. But if you do the math, right, that actually gives you 4 in the numerator. So this formula only works when you have equal numbers of clusters assigned to treatment and control, but you could figure out what this should be. You have unequal numbers, right, by just doing that simple math. Okay, so don't let the 4 throw you. That's why there's a 4. But let's take a look at this formula. And what do you notice? J is the number of clusters. Okay. N is the number of people. This is, N here is like the average number of people per cluster. So this is like observations per cluster. Not the total number of observations, by the way. This isn't like the total sample size. This is like the average number of people per cluster. Okay. Just think about basic, and we got square root there, right? Think about basic math. You can see here that because J is in the denominator, as J goes to like infinity, right? As J gets bigger and bigger and bigger, this standard error gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And theoretically, as you go toward infinity, this standard error would actually go towards 0. Let me be clear, as J goes towards infinity, right? Does everybody see that? So like the more clusters you add, the smaller the standard error gets, and there's just keep adding clusters, it's going to keep getting smaller. I mean, again, it's not like a linear, square root, but it's going to get small. Okay. Contrast that with the number of people per cluster, and because that's sitting here in the numerator, you can see what happens is that the number of people per cluster, as the number of people per cluster goes up, it can shrink this piece of the standard error formula, right? So you've got sigma squared, that's like that, like that's our pooled within cluster residual variance. And this can get smaller. I mean, this whole thing can get smaller as the number of people per cluster goes up. And so as n sub j goes to infinity, this whole thing could become 0. But even if this whole thing is 0, the smallest that your standard error is going to get is going to be the square root of 4 times tau naught divided by j, right? That's as small as it can get. And you can also see, maybe it's a little bit less obvious, but you can also see in here how the ICC is coming into play, because remember that there are only 2 pieces of information in the ICC, the tau naught and the sigma squared. And here's sigma squared right here, and here's tau naught right here, right? So that, again, essential formula that really is going to determine how sort of power works. I already said all this, so I'll skip that. I'm just saying what I just said. Okay, so I can also re-express that same formula in terms of the ICC, and you can see that now I've like explicitly sort of created like this standardized standard error formula kind of thing, where I've got the ICC, and again, might be a little bit less obvious, but what you see here is that as the ICC gets bigger, right, the standard error is bigger, sort of holding everything else constant. Bigger ICCs are going to give you bigger standard errors, which makes sense. Because again, each person, the bigger the ICC, the less information, independent information each person is actually contributing to the study. So as the ICC increases, holding everything else constant, the standard error increases. And again, if there's a lot of between clusters, the other lesson here is if there's tons of variability between clusters, we gain more power by increasing the number of clusters. Then if there's not very much between cluster variability, then increasing the number of people per cluster is more helpful than it is if there's a lot of between cluster variabilities. Okay, how do we get a standardized estimate of the effect size for a multi-level model? We just take our gamma naught 1, which is the difference between the treatment group and the control group. And again, so this is like a Cohens D kind of thing. The denominator is just the standard deviation of the outcome variable. So, and this is like right now, this is like an unconditional Cohens D. This isn't adjusted for covariance at this point, but like you can do that easily, actually. But, so you would just take the tau naught naught plus sigma squared from the unconditional model, and that gives you the total variance in the outcome variable. Take the square root of that, that's the standard deviation for the outcome variable. So if you want to get like just an unconditional Cohens D estimate, it's really quite simple. Now, again, if you wanted to, well, I'll just leave it there. Okay. So in the conclusion, we really have to think about how to randomize group, like how many groups we randomize is far more important than how many individuals per group. There are lots of complicated questions, especially when you start to figure in cost in terms of what the best allocation is. Okay, so now let's put covariates in. So everybody's with me so far, right? Now let's introduce covariates into our design. Now, this is so interesting, actually. So here, don't worry too much about the top, because if we assume equal group sizes, we could jump down to the bottom. A little bit simpler. So I've now expressed this in terms of the minimum detectable effect size. So remember, with minimum detectable effect size, smaller is better. So, but what's interesting here is that we can think about our sort of R squared, or again, covariate, like in regression, we think of covariates in terms of the proportion of variance in the outcome variable explained by the covariate, like an R squared, right? But remember, we're in multi-level land now. So, and this is a cluster randomized trial, so actually the intervention's happening at level 2. You could have covariates at the cluster level, or you could have covariates at the individual level. So let's just say we have kids that are clustered within classes, or let's say schools. Let's go with schools. Kids that are clustered within schools. Schools are randomly assigned to treatment and control. Okay? So you could have covariates at the student level at level 1. That could be something like a kid's pretest score, right? That'd be a great covariate. Or you could have covariates at the school level. That could be like school average pretest score. Let's say school average achievement in reading or whatever. This R squared C stands for this is like R squared for the cluster, the proportion of variance in the outcome variable explained by the cluster level covariates. And this is R squared I is the proportion of variance explained by the individual covariates. And so, and what's really interesting here is notice, okay, so it looks kind of similar, but here we're taking the ICC times 1 minus the proportion of variance explained by the cluster covariates plus 1 minus the ICC. So here's the ICC 0.5. This is going to be like 0.85 multiplied by 1 minus the proportion of variance that's explained by the individual covariates. And what might not be totally obvious to you when you look at that formula, and if not, that's fair, but the proportion of variance explained by the power increases as the proportion of variance explained by the cluster level covariate increases. And it does so, it also does increase when the proportion of variance explained by the individual level covariate increases. But it turns out that actually the cluster level variate often has a greater impact on power than the individual covariate does. So in a cluster randomized trial, being able to add cluster level covariates often gives you a bigger bang for your buck in terms of power than adding individual level covariates. And this is a very important point for those of you who are going to be researchers, because cluster level covariates are often much, much easier to collect and less expensive. What I'm saying to you is you might get more bang for your buck by just putting in pretest achievement at the school level than you do putting in pretest achievement at the individual level. And God knows it's easier to put in pretest achievement at the school level. Now, you can do both, actually. And of course, that's better still, right? But this is a really, this is great. This is really good for us, that adding cluster level covariates, which are often really cheap and easy to collect, can actually give us a pretty good bang for our buck. What I've done here is I've actually taken those formulas, because again, like when you look at the formula, maybe it's not totally obvious what's going on, but I've taken those formulas and I've kind of graphed out. Here is I'm assuming the ICC is 0.1, the number of clusters is 50, the number of people per cluster is 20. Okay, so we're just holding all that constant. And then here is like the R squared at either the cluster level or the individual level or both. So you can see if you have a cluster level covariate, here you go. Well, let's start with individual. If you've got an individual level covariate that explains like 60% of the variance, right? You know, it's your MDES, so lower is giving me more power. My MDES is falling, right? Goes from 0.3 to about, I don't know, about 0.27. But if I had a cluster level covariate of 0.6, look what happens. My MDES drops from 0.3 to about what, 0.23. So it drops quite a bit more. And then you can see if I have both of those things, it drops even still. So you can get both the individual and the cluster level, that's your best bet. But, you know, even if you can't get individual level data, having cluster level covariates can help you with your power. Same idea here, but here, like the last one, last picture, let's just compare and contrast. That's when the ICC is 0.1. So it's a relatively low interclass correlation coefficient. With an ICC of 0.2, which is pretty common for school-based designs, an ICC of 0.2 is pretty typical. Look what you see. The individual level covariate doesn't give me that much bang for my buck, right? I mean, it's like the MDS is dropping a little bit. The cluster covariate, look what happens. As the ICC goes up, the cluster covariate is really giving me much more bang for my buck than the individual level one. And here you can see adding both, yeah, okay, it's better, but it's not as much better as it was before when the ICC was 0.1. Does everybody see that? So yes. The x-axis is the minimum detectable effect size, and here lower is better, because lower minimum detectable effect size means higher power. That's the R squared. At the R squared for the cluster or the individual, you know, for the cluster or the individual or both. So those are R squareds. I should put those things on the axis. So how do I compute the R squareds for multi-level results? Well, R, you know this already, actually. We're going to use like an approximation. So we just take like for an R squared for the cluster, it would just be like the tau, right? The baseline tau minus the fitted tau divided by the baseline tau, like going to give us like an R squared for the cluster level. So the baseline would be like that baseline would be not including the covariate in the model, right? The fitted would be once I include this covariate in the model. So what's the tau before I include the covariate? What's the tau after I include the covariate? And then just divide by that tau before I include the covariate. That's going to give me a sort of an approximation for the cluster level R squared that I can then use in my power analysis. Same idea for the individual, except for now I'm using sigma squared. So what's the sigma squared before I put in the individual level covariate? What's the sigma squared after I put in the individual level covariate? And what's the sigma, divided by that baseline sigma squared. So that's how we get those R squareds. Obviously in a power analysis, I think for homework, we just tell you what the R squared is if you have to have one. Okay, so that's cluster randomized trials. What time is it, by the way? 11:17. Okay. So multi-site cluster randomized trial is the same kind of idea, but now in a multi-site cluster randomized trial, what's really happening is that I have like cluster, remember I've got cluster randomized trial, but I've got multiple, like it's being sort of replicated across sites, if you will. So I've got multiple classrooms being randomly assigned a treatment or control. And then you could sort of think about each school as being a little microcosm, like a little treatment control study of its own. And then that's replicated across schools. So you might not find that the treatment effect is the same across schools, right? I've got, and that's true for multi-site studies as well as multi-site cluster randomized studies. If you have treatment and control within a given site, you could imagine computing like what's the treatment effect within that site. Then you could get a treatment effect within every site, and you might find that there's actually variability in the treatment effects across sites. Now, again, every treatment effect we estimate is just an estimate, right? We don't know what the true treatment effect is. at any given site. But do you see the logic of like the treatment effect might actually vary across sites? And then the question is actually, is the amount of treatment effect variance across sites that I'm seeing? Like, I don't know. If there's a lot, there's a lot of variability in the treatment effect across sites. That actually, what does that mean? That means that like, that means that the average treatment effect is maybe, the average treatment effect is still salient, but it's more useful to have a lot of sites to be able to actually get a good estimate of what the treatment effect is. Like if you found that treatment effect just imagine it this way. You found that in some places the treatment effect is 0, in other places the treatment effect is 3, in other places the treatment effect is 10, in other places the treatment effect is 40, right? Like, if you've got treatment effects that bounce around a lot from site to site, and you want to have confidence in like, what is my average treatment, like what is the actual treatment effect? If the treatment effect is very different across sites, you want to have more sites to get a better and more accurate picture of what the treatment effect is. Whereas if I did a study and the treatment effect is 10 and this, like 9, 10, 11, 10, 9, 10, 11, 10 from site to site to site, I would feel like I don't need to have as many sites to be able to say, yeah, okay, the treatment effect is about 10, right? But if I had a treatment effect that went 0, 10, 20, 0, 10, 20, right? I'd be like, I don't know. Yeah, okay, it still averages 10, but I feel like I need more sites to really get a picture of what's going on because there's so much variability across sites in terms of what the treatment effect is. Does that make sense? So now into power, we add one more parameter. The number of clusters per site. The number of sites. So now J is now the number of clusters per site, not the number of clusters anymore, the number of clusters per site, and K is the number of sites. Now power is going to be a function of the number of people per cluster, which is still going to be less important than the number of clusters. But now J is not the thing that's going to totally drive the boat anymore either, because it's the number of clusters per site. And the number of sites is going to be really important. And it's going to be way more important if there's a lot of variability in terms of the treatment effect across sites. So what that means for multi-site cluster randomized trials is that I have to kind of think about the cluster size, the number of clusters, the number of sites, the interclass correlation, and the effect size, of course, and the effect size variability. So how much variability is there across sites? And then obviously, if you have proportion, the proportion of variance explained by level 2 covariates, because that's the level of randomization is going to be particularly important. All right. So all I want to say about that right now, I think I've got a formula to show you. Okay, so again, it can also be useful to calculate the power for the variance of the treatment effect. So if you want to know about sort of treatment, how much power do you have to even detect treatment effect variability? Because if I want to know if this, again, if you're thinking about moderational, if you're thinking about does this treatment work in different places, then and does it work differently in different places, then you're really talking about treatment effect variability. And if you want to try to use moderators to try to explain why treatments work better in some places than others, then you're sort of making the assumption that there is variability in the treatment effect. So power for the treatment effect variability is, again, a function of the interclass correlation coefficient, the effect size variability, the number of sites, and the number of clusters, cluster size, but really the number of sites and the effect size variability are going to be super important for determining the effect size variability. And the higher the variability of the effect size, the more sites you need to have adequate power to detect those effects. Okay, so how do we compute the standard error for a multi-site cluster randomized trial? Do you remember I showed you power for a cluster randomized trial? I showed you that standard error. You look at this formula. Notice that this is the exact same formula as the one that I showed you before. But what is added here is, remember how J was in the denominator? Well, J is in the denominator of all this still, but now I've added K, which is equal to the number of sites in the denominator. And now I've got tau beta 1, 1, which is really telling me about this variability in the treatment effects across sites. So the standard error for a multi-site cluster randomized trial, again, as you can see, is large part a function of the number of sites because it's in the denominator, so that's going to really drive things. And also the other piece that kind of comes into play that we didn't have with a cluster randomized trial is that effect size variability, which, by the way, again, this is like where it gets really hard because when you're trying to do a power analysis, you've got to make a guess for like how much effect size variability is there going to be. And sometimes you can find prior studies that estimate this, but sometimes you can't. And so then you just kind of have to make a good educated guess about what seems reasonable, which is kind of the thing about power analysis. You're making a lot of good educated guesses. All right. I'm going to skip that slide for right now because that actually has to do with the program we're going to look at in a second. And so now, actually, I think okay. So the standardized effect size, changing gears right now. So we just talked about cluster randomized trials and multi-site cluster randomized trials. So now we need to think about power for longitudinal designs. So in power for longitudinal design, you actually have to think about the standardized effect size for a polynomial trend. And remember, like in a linear model, we would just have like a first order polynomial, right? But you could actually have a quadratic model. You could have a higher order polynomial model. So the standardized effect size for a polynomial trend is really just the ratio of the group mean difference to the standard deviation of the true change component. So for any of these, like for example, let's just think about a linear model, right? So for a linear model, you would have this slope, right? And then you would look at the slope divided by tau 1, 1. So like this would be like your beta coefficient for, say, the slope, beta 1, 0 divided by tau 1, 1. Because remember, this is really telling you about the between person variance in the slope, right? And then, oh, actually, I take that back. This is going to be beta, not looking at the slope in general here. Actually, we're looking at the difference between the treatment and control in terms of the slope. Maybe like beta, beta P1. So beta could be beta 1, 1, depends on, again, P just means, right? Like, I don't know what the whole model is, but this is the difference between the experimental and the control groups in terms of their growth slopes divided by the between cluster difference, like the between cluster variability in their growth. It's going to make a lot more sense when I show it to you, actually. But here are 5 things you need to remember about power in longitudinal designs, because it's somewhat similar to what we just talked about, but it's a little bit different. So increasing time points is going to increase your power. And how many time points you need is going to be influenced by the model that you're trying to fit. So the more complicated, remember how we fit polynomial models, we fit piecewise models, we fit linear models. If you're just running a linear model, you don't need as many time points as you do if you're running like a quadratic or a cubic model, which I think, makes sense, right? So yes, increasing the number of time points does increase power, and it has more of an effect on power when you have those higher order polynomial or more complicated level 1 models, which I think, that's just like kind of obvious, right? Here, increasing sample size also increases power. And obviously, power depends on the effect size. If we're thinking about the difference between a treatment and a control group, you know, in terms of their growth slopes, for example, you know, obviously the bigger the effect, the more that is. But power also depends on like this tau, the between person variance in the slopes. So, and think about this, like the between person variability in the slopes. If there's a lot of between person variability in the slopes, what does that mean? That means like, let's say, looks like this, right? Let's say blue is treatment and red is control or something, right? If there's a lot of between person variability in the growth slopes, then that, again, from an effect size perspective, that means that, you know, you've got a lot more sort of error, right? Like it's going to be, you're going to need sort of more people to be able to detect whether this difference between the slopes is statistically significant, right? So like more between person variability in the growth slopes means you need more people to detect whether the difference between the two groups is equal. Or not equal, well, equal or unequal, right? So the power to detect differences. But power also depends upon the within person variance. And, you know, if you have a lot of within person variance, right, then you have a lot of like residual variance, even after accounting for these slopes. And so a lot of within person variance will also weaken your power. But basically, if the slopes differ a lot across people, you always need more people. But especially if slopes differ across people, you need more people. If the slopes are pretty similar across people, you can get away with fewer people and have decent power. So in longitudinal designs, there's really a trade-off in terms of like study duration, how frequently you observe people, and the sample size. So adding observations does actually increase power. And again, if you've got those more complex longitudinal designs, it becomes even more important to have more observations per time point. But like adding people also increases power. And if there's a lot of between person variance in those slopes, then you really need to add people. So like if you, for example, if you have tons of within person variance and very little between person variance in the growth slopes, you might be better off adding time points, right? That might give you a bigger bang for your buck. Whereas if you have a lot of between person variance in the growth slopes, you really need to add people to get enough power. So there's like, in longitudinal designs, there's really this trade-off between the number of time points and the number of people. And what that trade-off looks like depends on all of these variance components. So adding people is most helpful when you have a lot of between person variability in those slopes. Okay. So I'm gonna not go through those because I'll show you those when we get to the power program. So in randomized trials with repeated measures data, you're going to see that they're going to ask you about the variability of the level 1 residual, which is the within person variance, the variability of the level 1 coefficient, which is the between person variation on the growth slope, and then the standardized effect size and the polynomial order. All right, I think I'm almost done. There's one more slide here. Let's see. Oh yeah. Okay.
There's a few more in.
Well, yeah. So let's do. I don't want to show that because we're going to show that in a minute. Yeah. So in a cluster randomized trial with repeated measures, again, we haven't really talked about this, but like, so here we've kind of got we can think about the intraclass correlation coefficient here as really being like, again, the sort of between, we've got this between person and within person. Yeah, I don't want to talk about the cluster randomized trials with repeated measures. I don't think you have to do that actually, because this is even more complicated than what I just talked about. This is also a 3-level model. So we're going to skip that. Let's skip the cluster randomized with repeated measures. And I do want to save this before we go to our program. So again, the effect size for linear reporting, if you're thinking about effect sizes for like linear trends, like what does that look like? Let's just say imagine I have beta 1 naught is equal to the slope for the control group, right? And then beta 1,1 would actually be like the slope differential usually for the treatment group. Right? So we have like beta 1,1 is just like, that's the intercept of the slope. Beta 1,1 is going to be the effective treatment on the slope. That's a better way of saying it. Effective treatment on slope. So this, I think, often seems really weird to people because we're talking about slopes now instead of just regular mean differences. But if we want to come up with some sort of an effect size for a linear trend, what we can do is just take this, because this is the difference between the slopes, it goes in the numerator the same way that the difference between means would go in the numerator. So we're just saying like, oh, let's think about the difference between two slopes. That's beta 1,1. And then what we need here is some sort of measure of like the standard deviation, right? So we could put in there some sort of measure of the standard, like we're putting in there some sort of measure of the standard deviation. And that will give us a good effect size estimate for efficacy reporting for the slope. This, though, is going to give you the treatment effect in a standard Cohens D type metric, but it's not actually going to be the exact same formula that you're using to compute the power analysis, because the power analysis is actually going to use a standard deviation that takes into account the it's going to take into account basically like the within person covariance more. And so when you think about effect sizes for efficacy reporting versus effect sizes for like power analysis, and actually this is true not just for longitudinal designs, but for cross-sectional designs too, those may actually deviate. So this is sort of like marginal or effect size. Okay, let's go to our power program. You're going to love this program because it's super easy. I swear, I promise. And I honestly think that the best way to understand everything that I just said is to play around with this program on your own. So we'll play around with it together, and then you get to play around with it yourself. So all you have to do, I'm assuming that you all have like downloaded this onto your computers at this point. Just go to optimal design 3.01, whatever it's called. You don't have to worry about, this is the manual, by the way, which is really nice. It's like a 100-page PDF that's really helpful. Just click on this little blue thing and the power program is going to come up. It doesn't look like much, I know, but this is it. That's the program. And don't worry about empirically based MDES. We're not going to use that. What that is like those other two files, they've actually created files that have like data from other studies if you wanted to like use that to kind of come up with your own power, but we don't care about that. Okay, so don't worry about that. Go to design, and the first thing that you're going to do is it's going to give you these choices. We're not going to use meta-analysis at all. Okay? But we've got person randomized trials. So that, if you think about a person randomized trial, that's, if it's not longitudinal, that's just like a single level. So you could actually use this to run a single level power analysis. Cluster randomized trials.
Wait, I'm sorry, Betsy. Does everybody know where to find it? I'm seeing confusion. I don't think there's a Mac.
Oh yeah, there is no Mac version. What? Yeah.
You can do it through UConn anywhere.
Yeah, you can. What?
That's what I'm hearing. Yeah. And
Oh,
then
okay.
it's like a PC.
It's like a remote PC. Oh, very cool. Okay.
That's how you can like log into some of the software and stuff.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the fact that there is no Mac version. Okay, so person level randomized trial. Got it? So person level randomized trial, if you didn't have, like, that's just like single level, but let's look at what our options are here. So click on that and you'll see, so we got person level, single level trial. So that's just people randomized to treatment and control. The next one is a multi-site trial. So remember, we talked about that. That's people are randomized to treatment and control, but I have multiple sites. And then the last one is repeated measures. So that's what I was actually just talking about. So I've got repeated measures within person, but people are randomized to treatment and control. So that's like a 2-level randomized design. I'm not going to talk about the one that I skipped is actually like a 3-level longitudinal that I'm not going to talk about. So single level trial, multi-site, repeated measures. Now the next one is the one we talked about the most, and I think is what you have to do the most with the homework, is a cluster randomized trial. And you can see if you go to cluster randomized trial, you can choose cluster randomized or multi-site cluster randomized trial. We talked about both of those different times. The last two, we didn't talk about anything in those two. So don't worry about either of those two options. Just focus on the top two. So let's start with a cluster randomized trial, because that's what we did the most. So we're going to go to a cluster randomized trial, and let's just go to a regular cluster randomized trial. Whoop. And we're going to click on that. And it's asking, like, is the treatment at level 2? Is the treatment at level 3? Or are there repeated measures? We're not doing anything with repeated measures, cluster randomized trial. We're not doing treatment at level 3, cluster randomized trial. We're just doing like kids within schools, schools are clusters, something like that. So it's treatment at level 2. Okay, so now I go to treatment at level 2. Oops, hold on, you're making, I don't want to see that thing. You're in my way. Thank you. Okay, treatment at level 2. And now I have some more options. And all of these options are really, okay, so first, forget about the bottom 2 options. We're not doing anything with those. But all of these options are really about what do you want to see on the x-axis and what do you want to see on the y-axis. So we've talked about power and we've talked about minimum detectable effect size. So I might want to see minimum detectable effect size on the y-axis, or I might want to see power on the y-axis. Those are your 2 options. Both of those are telling me about power. Remember, as the minimum detectable effect size goes down, the power is going up, right? When I choose minimum detectable effect size, I'm going to choose the minimum detectable effect size at a given power, which is generally going to be 0.8. Okay? When I choose power, but let's start with power. So let's say power, and then that's going to be on my y-axis. And now the question, so this is always your y-axis over here. Now the question is, what's going to be on my x-axis? Right? And I could graph this power curve as a function of like cluster size, which is the number of people per cluster, the total number of clusters, the ICC, the effect size, or the proportion of variance explained by a covariate. But let's do power versus the number of clusters, because we said, boy, that's really important. So now we're going to go power versus the total number of clusters. There we go. Now I get another blank screen. But you're with me so far, right? So far, not so bad. So now I'm going to go across. This is, by the way, the things that I skipped in the PowerPoint where I was like, oh, we're going to talk about that later. That's just a sheet that defines what all of these things across the top are. So if you go to slide, see where it is. Oh, MSRCS. Okay, maybe I only did it for 3 levels. I didn't do it for 2 levels, but for the multi-site cluster randomized and for the longitudinal, I did it. So, sorry about that, but this one's pretty obvious. Alpha is set at 0.05 by default. I could change. N is the number of people per cluster, the average number of people per cluster. Delta is my standardized effect size. So this is like just think of it as like a Cohens D. This is my R squared, that's going to be my R squared. Okay? And then these 2 buttons, X and Y, just allow you to change like what's being displayed on the X and Y axis. You see how it's like X? It just allows you to change the view. And then this is like print, save, stuff like that. So the only buttons that really, I mean, again, if you're not changing alpha, which you pretty much never are, the only buttons you have to worry about here are number of people per cluster, effect size, and oh, did I say that? I forgot. I skipped that one the last time. Intra-class correlation coefficient. ICC. And then if you're using covariates, covariates are going to go in there. So let's do a power analysis. And we're just going to like, here we go. I clicked on N. Did everybody see that? I just clicked on N. And by default, the number of people per cluster is set to 20. And this, let's say this is that's fine. Let's leave the number of people per cluster at 20. That's fine. I'm going to click on OK. Something happened. Okay, but maybe this isn't what I want. So let's just go through my buttons anyway and adjust them. So like as soon as you do something, you're going to get whatever the defaults were. So remember, this is effect size, delta, above 0, obviously. So I could like look at what's my power look like if my Cohens D is, let's say, let's go back to Cohen's guidelines. Let's go 0.2, 0.5, and 0.8. How about that? That would be kind of fun, right? So let's go 0.2, 0.5, and 0.8. Okay? Again, don't freak yet. Let's go through the rest of the buttons. I mean, you can get a lot of lines on here, but sometimes in your best interest to simplify so you can actually read the thing. So now this is my ICC. So typical school-based studies usually have an ICC of like 0.15. So let's change this to 0.15. And for now, I'm not going to have a second ICC just so it'll like simplify my power curves. Okay. All right, there we go. So now we can take a look at what we've got. And that's it. I'm done. So now you can see over here, it's telling you what you set. It's saying, okay, for all of these, the ICC is 0.5. For this blue curve, the effect size is 0.2. The red curve, the effect size is 0.5. The green curve is the effect size of 0.8. And this is power. What do you notice about the power? Now, everything else is being held constant, right? Like I've set the number of people per cluster to be 20. And this down here is the total number of clusters. So what do you notice? First thing you notice is obviously as you increase the number of clusters, the power goes up, right? But look here at like, if my effect size is 0.2, like right now I'm up to 100 clusters. 100 clusters with 20 people per cluster. So this is a total sample size of 2,000 right here. Pretty big, 100 clusters with 20 cluster, right? And if I assume like power of 0.8 is what power of 0.8, this is like where I want to be, right? I never get there at the effect size of 0.2. Does everybody see that? And you might be saying to yourself, well, what is the power there? And this is sometimes a little annoying because it depends exactly on where you click, but also kind of cool. If you want to know what the power is, maybe it doesn't work with the touch screen, but just click on it. You see that? It's saying, oh, look, with 100 clusters, your power here is basically, we can round to 2 decimal places. Everybody round to 2 decimal places, okay? So it's not that exact. It's like all guesses. So 2 decimal places is plenty, right? So here we can see it's saying like with a J of like 100, and this is where I say it's like moderately annoying because like, okay, you see how it's like 100.01, whatever, close enough, right? So with 100 clusters and an effect size of 0.2 and 20 people within each cluster on average, my power is only 0.62. So with an effect size of 2, I can't get to adequate power. Well, I could. That's where I could come up here and I could actually change. I went to the X. If I wanted to change my X-axis to go to 200, you see how I just changed my X-axis. So now I've got 200 clusters. You can see eventually I do get to a power of 0.8, but this is like a ginormous stuff. Okay? Contrast that with when I have an effect size of 0.5. What does it take to get a power of 0.8 with an effect size of 0.5 and 20 people per cluster and an ICC of 0.15? Doesn't like my line. Bothered by my line, but somebody else who's, see, okay, well here. It's about, what is it? It's about, somebody tell me who can click on it because it won't let me.
The green line or
The red line. 27 point something clusters. And obviously You should probably round up because you can't actually have fractional clusters, right? So like it would take about 28 clusters to have adequate power with an effect size of 0.5. What about here? Is it now? It's really mad at me. I don't know if I can zoom this, to be
Oh, I
honest.
think you can do.
This I can delete, right?
Yeah.
Scratch? There we go. Okay, here we go. So yeah, so we're at about, see that? So power is 0.8 at about 27.4 clusters, but I would call that 28 clusters. Gives me adequate power at 0.5. So 28, and by the way, this is 28 total clusters. So this would be like 14 assigned to treatment, 14 assigned to control, 28 total clusters, which is not that bad, really, is it? 20 people per cluster. And if I think the effect size is going to be 0.8, now I can come over here. Here we go. And it looks like I need about, 14 clusters, let's say. About 7 assigned to treatment and 7 assigned to control to get adequate power with an effect size of 0.8. So you can see that effect size really drives the power, right? The higher the effect size, the more power I have, holding everything else constant. Now I could mess with other stuff here too, though, right? So I could say, let's go back here and say, okay, let's say I have 50 people per cluster. Well, actually, and let's say my effect sizes are 0.3 and 0.4, let's say. Okay, and let's say, let's see how big a difference an interclass correlation coefficient makes. So let's say my ICC is either 0.1 or 0.3. I get a 0.3 in there? Yeah, there we go. So again, it's going to remind you what you've got. 50 people per cluster, and I've got an effect size. The blues are effect sizes of 0.3. The reds are effect sizes of 0.4. So you can see I've got a lot more power with an effect size of 0.4. But just looking at the red versus the red, the solid is an interclass correlation coefficient of 0.1. The dashed is an interclass correlation coefficient of 0.3. And you can see that the higher the ICC, the less power I have. So like the more, right, at a given number of clusters, the less power I have. And so the more clusters I need. So for example, right here, I've got like power of 0.8 with like 65 point something clusters when my ICC is 0.3, but when my ICC is 0.1, yeah, when my ICC is 0.1, I only need like 27 clusters. So messing around with this, I mean, again, it's pretty easy and you can't like break it. So you can just mess around and put in the numbers and it will really help you. I mean, once you kind of play with these curves, it will really help you to see like exactly how power is a function of the number of people per cluster, the number of clusters. Now, remember, I chose that, you can only have one of these open at a time, by the way. So if I want to change my view, I have to close this. But I chose the number of clusters. I could go to, remember how I did this? Treatment at level 2. I could go to, let's say I'm going to go to MDES so I can show one of those before we break. And I'm going to go versus cluster size. Okay, so now this is going to put that minimum detectable effect size on the y-axis. Here I'm going to set the number of clusters, and it's going to put the number of people per cluster on the x-axis. So we're going to go through this. So we've got number of clusters. I don't know. How many clusters? Let's say 20. Make it 30. Let's say 30 clusters. That was kind of the magic number from before, right? So we've got 30 clusters. Again, something comes out right away. But because I'm doing minimum detectable effect size, I'm setting the power. Now, by default, it sets the power at 0.8, which is kind of the magic number. So I'm going to leave it there. But that's what that P is. The P is just for power. I just did power. I wanted to come over here. This is my interclass correlation. Let's say my interclass correlation is 0.2. Make it 0.2. Oh, and did everybody see what happened when I changed it from 0.1? What was it? 0.1? 0.05. I think it was 0.05 to 0.2. Did everybody see how it jumped up there? Right? Now the minimum detectable effect size is much lower. Higher rather. The power is much lower. And then here, we haven't done anything with this yet. But this is the proportion, and you can see it's the proportion of explained variance in the level. Luckily, it kind of tells you what everything is. The proportion of explained variance in the level 2 mean outcome by the level 2 covariance. So this is like adding a level 2 covariate, like we talked about. And it's the proportion of explained variance, like an R squared. So let's go ahead. I'm going to put in like 0.25. 0.25 means that the correlation between the covariate and the outcome is what? Put in 0.25. What's the correlation between the covariate and the outcome? 0.5, right? Because 0.5 squared is 0.25. So just remember, it's a correlation squared, right? So let's put that in, 0.25, and that's a pretty decent size, right? Okay, so now you can see, again, this is the minimum detectable effect size, so lower is better. See, my minimum detectable effect size goes down as remember here I'm doing the number of people per cluster goes down. But remember how I showed you that formula for the standard error? And I said, yeah, up to a point, but after a certain point, it really doesn't matter how many more people you add per cluster. It's not really going to help you. That's exactly what we're seeing here, right? Is that like, yeah, okay, the minimum detectable effect size goes down to a certain point, but basically from about somewhere like around here on, you can see you're not really getting any bang for your buck by adding people. What we would need to do to get this minimum detectable effect size to go down is to add clusters. Here we're holding the number of clusters constant. Yeah? Okay, in my last few minutes, let me just do let me just show you longitudinal because we spent so much time doing longitudinal. And it's not as bad as it probably looked on my slides. Okay, so go to person randomized trials, repeated measures. And let's do power for treatment on, we're not going to mess with quadratic or cubic change. Let's just do power for treatment on linear change there. And I think I need to get rid of that line. This is right. And the thing for the longitudinal, and this is where I do actually have a slide. It is that explains all of this. It's slide 44. So for longitudinal, there's this thing called set, which I think at first looks a little bit confusing. So let's just kind of walk this through. So F just means the frequency of observation. E means duration of the study. So for example here, like this would be saying like people are measured once a year, 5 years, whatever it is. And then it is computing the M because it's assumed, look at this, right? It's like, oh, you're measuring people once a year for 5 years, but you're going to have a baseline measure at the beginning. So it's like start, then you measure 5 years. So that's one, basically like, right, once you're 5 years, so that's going to be M of 6. Now, watch what happens if I went like, we're measuring people, let's say, twice a year for 5 years. Oh, wait, hold on. It just did it. But anyway, twice a year for 5 years. There you go. You can see that now the M is 11, right? Because it's 2 measures per year for each of 5 years plus a baseline. And it tells you right there. This is the hardest part. And I think if I ask you to do one, I'll tell you what to put in here. But like the hardest part of doing this, you've got to guess at the for a longitudinal design, you have to guess at the variability for the level 1 residual. and the variability for the level 1 slope coefficient. And then the standardized effect size, that isn't that bad. That's, again, we're just thinking about the difference between the two groups in terms of the growth slope. Again, if there is one of these on the homework, I tell you what all of these things are. But like, this is the variability of sigma. This is the variability of tau 1,1. And what's really important here is just to kind of be thinking about what the ratio, what like a reasonable ratio might be. And then this is the standardized effect size. And once you put all that in, then you actually get a slope, get a power curve, and it gives you the power curve, and the x-axis is the number of participants. See that like the power of 0.4, effect size variability that we specified, we need to get to a power of 0.8, we need about 200 and some people, right? All right, but that will vary as a function of the number of time points as well. Remember, I set the number of time points. So you can mess around with like, you know, with a given effect size, is it better to add time points or is it better to add people? Make sense? So for your homework, I think there are like 4 problems that give you specific numbers to plug into optimal design to get power out. But again, I would encourage you to obviously do the 4 problems, but also just mess around with this, because just messing around with this will really help you to get a really good intuitive conceptual sense of what influences power and what things have more or less influence on power. And so like, I really think that so much of what I talked about today will kind of click as you mess around with optimal design. And I'm sure you can appreciate that there's absolutely no coding. So it's really easy to mess around with. But if you get stuck on any of the stuff, let us know. And there will be office hours next week. And that's it. Hey, look at that. 12 noon on the dot. I did it. Woohoo. Bring in questions for next week, things you want to review before the final.
Are we good without meeting? I gotta get. We're at 1 o'clock. Yes.